I've done a lot of camping over the years, mostly solo, mostly deep in. I'm not someone who parks their truck in a designated lot and walks 15 minutes to a tent site with a picnic table and fire ring. When I go out, it's usually with everything I need on my back and the intention of not seeing another person for days. It's not about finding myself or anything poetic like that. I just don't like noise, and being alone in the woods calms me in a way nothing else does. This trip was no different. It was mid-September, the perfect time in the northern Rockies when the bugs have mostly died down. The air is cool but not cold, and the first hints of snow are showing up on the high peaks. I had picked an area I hadn't explored before, somewhere way off-trail in a narrow drainage off the Bitterroot Range, near the Idaho-Montana border. No named lakes on the map, just a maze of creeks, rock outcroppings, and old logging remnants that hadn't been touched in decades. I planned for 5 nights. Car to campsite was about 11 miles of hiking, the last few through bushwhack terrain. I brought everything: bear spray, satellite messenger, extra food, multiple navigation tools, even a spare headlamp. I wasn't careless. I'd done this long enough to know what happens to careless people in the wilderness. The first day was uneventful. The sun was out, I made good time, and I didn't see another person after the first 2 hours. That night, I camped in an open meadow near a cold, shallow creek. I hung my food far away, kept my gear tight, and went to sleep with that familiar feeling of deep silence all around me. There's a unique quiet out there. Not total silence, but a kind of layered absence of people. You hear the small noises, wind through the trees, maybe a squirrel or two. But it's so different from human noise that your brain registers it as background. It soothes rather than alarms. The second day, I went deeper into the drainage. The trail had vanished by mid-morning, replaced by old elk paths and fallen trees. The terrain got steeper. There were signs of past human presence. An old rusted bucket near a stump, broken glass scattered under moss, a collapsed cabin so rotted that only the nails and part of the stovepipe were still recognizable. I kept moving. That night, I set up camp at a higher elevation, right on the edge of a dry bench above a split in the valley. Below me, a small stream trickled through thick brush. I had to climb down 30 feet to get water. I took note of that. Injuring an ankle or knee out here would be a serious problem. It was hard country. That night was the first time something felt a little off. Not a big event. Nothing loud or obvious. Just something. I woke up around 2 a.m., which I do sometimes. I wasn't cold, wasn't hungry, didn't need to pee. I just woke up. I was lying still in my bag, listening. No moon that night, so the tent was pitch black. Outside, nothing moved. I strained to hear anything, but the only sound was that quiet, trickling creek far below. Still, something didn't feel right. It was like the air was thicker somehow, the silence heavier. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I'd been alone too long, and eventually I drifted back to sleep. The next day, I pushed even farther up the drainage. My goal was a small, unnamed lake at around 8,200 feet, nestled in a bowl of granite and alpine fir. It was slow going. The brush was thick, the slope steep, and I had to stop multiple times to check the map and compass. No trail, no signs of use. When I finally reached the lake, it was as remote as I'd hoped. No campsites, no fire rings, no litter. Just a cold, deep pocket of water surrounded by cliffs. I didn't swim, water that high is glacier-fed and brutally cold. But I washed my face, refilled my bottles, and found a flat area under some trees to pitch the tent. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, I heard a sound that made me freeze mid-step. It was the first real, unnatural sound I'd heard in days. A clicking noise, sharp and metallic, almost like a camera shutter or 2 rocks hitting just right, came from the trees behind me, upwind. I stopped breathing and turned slowly, eyes scanning the branches. Nothing moved. No wind, no birds, no squirrels. I waited for a minute, maybe 2, heart pounding a little harder than I wanted to admit. Then I heard it again. Click, click, click. Closer this time. Now, I know what animals sound like. I've heard bear huffs, elk bugles, mountain lion screams, and all the weird noises pine trees make in the wind. This was none of those. This was deliberate, and it stopped as soon as I started paying attention. I didn't run. Running makes things worse. I made a wide loop around my camp, checked for tracks, found nothing. The ground was too dry for prints. I set my bear spray right next to the tent that night, and even though I was exhausted, I didn't fall asleep for hours. The fourth day started cloudy and stayed that way. I planned to use it as a layover day. No hiking, just relaxing and maybe doing a bit of fishing if the weather held. But I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. That clicking noise had burrowed into my brain. It didn't make sense. Even thinking about it made the hair on my arms stand up. Late that morning, I went exploring up a narrow side ravine near the lake. Just curiosity. Maybe I'd find a better vantage point or a waterfall or something interesting. After about 30 minutes of climbing, I noticed a strange formation along the rock wall. What looked like an old game trail running beside a narrow ledge. I followed it carefully, stepping slow, testing each foothold. About 100 feet up, the ledge opened into a small flat shelf. A perfect overlook of the valley below. It would have been a great place to sit and eat lunch if it weren't for the pile of bones. They were old, mostly cleaned by time and animals. A mix of deer and elk from the look of it. Some skulls, a few long bones, scattered rib fragments. But what stopped me cold was how they were arranged. Piled intentionally in the center of the shelf, like some kind of collection. Not in a circle, not ceremonial, just gathered. And next to them was an old tarp, faded blue, mostly shredded and buried in pine needles. I pulled it aside with a stick and found what looked like an ancient backpack frame beneath it. Aluminum, bent, rusted. The fabric was long gone. No tags, no gear, just remnants. I stood there a long time just staring. There was no blood, no sign of violence. But someone had used this spot long ago. Someone had brought that pack here, and someone had stacked those bones. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe some old hunter or trapper had dragged kills here for butchering. But it didn't feel like that. When I got back to camp, I packed everything. I'd planned one more night, but I wanted out. I didn't trust that place anymore. I hiked fast, pushing hard, ignoring the fatigue in my legs. I dropped down the drainage, cutting elevation quickly, and made it almost 5 miles before sunset forced me to stop. I found a small clearing well off the creek and set up camp with no fire. Just a cold meal, some water, and my sleeping bag. I didn't even unroll the tent. I wanted to be able to grab my stuff and move if I had to. That night was the worst. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but the moon was out, bright enough to see by. I was lying still and I could feel it before I heard it. That deep, ancient kind of fear you don't question. Something was nearby, close. I kept still, listening. First, nothing. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate step on dry needles. Then another. Then silence. Then the click. Click. It was behind me, maybe 20 feet. I stayed still, barely breathing. The hairs on my neck were burning. Then another step. Closer. I didn't know if it was human or animal, but it moved like it was thinking, like it was being careful. I reached for the bear spray slowly, my fingers numb. Then it moved again, faster this time, 2 steps, 3, and then silence. I sat up, ready to bolt, but nothing came. Nothing attacked. I scanned the woods, my vision blurry from panic and the brightness of the moon. Nothing. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as it was light, I broke camp and hiked the rest of the way out without stopping. I moved fast, barely drank water, didn't eat. I didn't feel safe until I reached my truck. I drove for hours, not even thinking, just trying to get away from that drainage. When I finally reached a gas station in a small Idaho town, I realized my hands were still shaking. I never reported what I saw. What would I even say? That I found a pile of bones and an old pack and heard clicking noises at night? No laws were broken, no crimes proven. But that doesn't mean nothing happened. I've camped since then, of course. I still love the woods, but I don't go off-trail anymore. I don't bushwhack into unnamed drainages. I stay on the maps. I stay where other people go. Because somewhere in those mountains, something was watching me. And it wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was real. It was quiet. And it knew the land better than I did. It was human. I'm sure of that now. And it was hunting. night I decided to camp alone in the middle of nowhere remains the most unsettling experience of my life. I had done a lot of solo camping before, nothing too wild, but enough to be confident. I knew how to prepare, what to bring, how to stay safe, and how to keep calm when things didn't go as planned. But that night, everything went wrong in ways I could never have imagined. I picked a remote spot deep in the woods of a national forest I had never been to before. It was a place marked on the map as undeveloped land, far from any official campsites or trails. I wanted solitude. I wanted to be completely alone with nature, away from the constant noise of life and the distractions of the city. The forest was dense, full of towering pines and thick underbrush, and the air was cool for late spring. I packed my gear carefully the day before. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for the temperatures I expected, plenty of water, a portable stove, some dehydrated meals, a good flashlight with extra batteries, a reliable multi-tool, a compass, and a paper map. My phone had no signal that far in, so I didn't even bother trying to rely on it. I also brought a small first aid kit and pepper spray just in case. The hike in was tough. The path wasn't marked well, and I had to cross a few small streams and push through thick bushes. My boots got wet and muddy. I moved slow, careful not to twist an ankle or step on a loose rock. After about 3 hours, I found a small clearing about the size of a basketball court, surrounded by tall trees and dense shrubs. It was flat and dry, perfect for setting up camp. The ground was covered with a soft layer of pine needles, and I could hear a distant creek somewhere nearby. I set up my tent carefully, staking it securely and arranging the rain fly over it. The sun was still high enough that the woods around me were bright, but I knew it would be dark soon. I made a quick meal on my stove, heating some dehydrated soup and brewing tea. I ate slowly, enjoying the silence and the fresh air, feeling calm and at ease. As the sun began to set, the forest changed. The colors shifted to deep blues and grays, and shadows stretched long between the trees. Birds stopped singing, and the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush became the main sound. I got inside my tent early, zipped it up tightly, and switched on my flashlight to read a book I had brought along. The temperature dropped quickly, and I pulled my sleeping bag tight around me. First, nothing felt wrong. But then, around 10:30 p.m., I started to hear noises outside the tent that didn't make sense. It wasn't the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, or the wind brushing through the needles. These were deliberate, low noises. Something was moving outside the tent, but it wasn't far away, it was close. Too close. I froze, listening carefully. There was a slow, shuffling sound coming from just beyond the edge of the clearing. The noise was like the dragging of feet or something heavy being pulled over the forest floor. It was uneven, almost like something was limping. The hair on my neck stood up. I thought about what it could be. Maybe a deer? No, deer don't make that kind of noise. Maybe a bear? But bears make loud grunts and heavy breathing, not slow dragging sounds. Whatever it was moving cautiously, as if it didn't want to make too much noise but was trying to come closer. I reached for my flashlight and shone it outside the tent. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated the edge of the clearing. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, a large shape moved into the light. It was tall, hunched, and covered in dark fur. I instantly thought bear again, but the way it moved was off. It was slower and more careful, almost deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest. I whispered to myself to stay calm. I grabbed my pepper spray and unzipped the tent flap just a crack, keeping most of the tent between me and the outside. The shape was still there, just beyond the clearing, standing on two legs for a moment before it dropped back down to all fours. I realized what I was seeing was a person, a man, probably disheveled and wild from the looks of it. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he had long hair tangled with leaves and dirt. His eyes reflected in the flashlight's beam, wide and wild. The guy was watching me. I didn't move. My mind raced. What the hell was he doing here? Why was he lurking just outside my tent at night? I quietly reached for my phone to call for help, but remembered there was no signal here. I switched it off quickly so I wouldn't drain the battery. I needed to think fast. I grabbed my multi-tool and held it ready. I wasn't going to give him a chance to get in or surprise me. My whole body tensed. The man didn't say anything. He just stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching, waiting. I slowly reached for my flashlight again and flashed it directly at him. He flinched and retreated a few steps but didn't run. At that moment, I heard a loud crack behind me. I spun around in my tent and saw the underbrush rustling violently. Something was moving through the trees behind me. The man looked back, his eyes wide with alarm this time. Then he dropped his gaze and started moving away from the clearing, limping badly as he went. The rustling behind me grew louder. Something was pushing through the bushes fast. My breath caught in my throat. Whatever it was coming towards me. I grabbed my bag and started unzipping the tent quickly, preparing to run. I needed to get out of there before whatever was out there got close. But the moment I unzipped the tent fully, I caught sight of it. A large, dark figure burst into the clearing and stopped a few feet from me. It was a huge man, dressed in heavy layers, with a rough beard and wild eyes. He looked like he had been living in the woods for weeks, maybe months. His hands were clenched into fists. He didn't say a word. He just stared. I backed up into the tent, grabbing my pepper spray and multi-tool, ready to defend myself. The tent walls rustled as he circled around it, stopping now and then to pound his fists against the fabric. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I realized the first man was his companion, and they were both watching me. The second one was more aggressive, dangerous. I tried to stay calm. I whispered to myself that this was still just a human, that if I stayed quiet and didn't provoke them, maybe they would leave. Suddenly, I remembered the emergency whistle I had packed. It was small, attached to my backpack strap. I grabbed it and blew it hard, hoping someone would hear it. The effect was immediate. The two men stopped what they were doing and looked towards the noise, then quickly disappeared into the forest. I didn't wait. I packed up everything as fast as I could, ignoring the cold sweat on my face and the tremble in my hands. I grabbed my backpack and slipped out of the tent, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. I didn't see them again, but I knew they were watching. I ran as fast as I could down the path I came, following the creek until I hit the main trail. I didn't stop for water or rest. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. It took me almost 4 hours to reach the ranger station at the edge of the forest. I was shaking and soaked in sweat and mud. When I told the ranger what happened, he nodded grimly and said this wasn't the first time someone had reported encounters like that. There were some people living illegally in the forest, vagrants or survivalists who didn't want to be found or bothered. They could be unpredictable, even violent. I learned later from the ranger that one of those men had been wanted for robbery and assault, and the other was his injured companion. They'd been hiding out in the woods for months. I was lucky I stayed calm, stayed quiet, and kept my wits about me. That night taught me a lot about how thin the line is between peace and danger in the wild. You think you're alone, safe, and in control, but the woods have their own rules, and sometimes the biggest threat isn't nature itself, but the people hiding inside it. I had spent the last 6 months grinding through a soul-sucking corporate job in a windowless office stacked in the middle of a cold high-rise in a loud, angry city. I was starting to feel like a rat in a metal cage. Same breakfast every day, same elevator ride, same meetings that led nowhere. The only thing that kept me sane was the calendar. I had taken 2 weeks off in late September, and unlike most people I knew, I wasn't heading to a resort or flying out to see family. I wanted silence, nature, time away from phone signals and blinking lights and people. That's how I landed on the idea of camping alone. I'd done it before, plenty of times, actually. Back in my 20s, I'd hike and camp out by myself all the time, in the Rockies, in the Catskills, even parts of Alaska once. But it had been a few years since I'd done anything serious. I wasn't rusty, though. I still had all my gear. I knew how to purify water, how to read a compass, how to take care of myself if something went wrong. I told myself that experience was like muscle memory. I just needed to get back into it. I picked a place called Harrow Gorge. You won't find it in tourist books or even on many hiking blogs. It's tucked deep into a forest preserve in northern Idaho. It's not exactly forbidden, but it's not promoted either. The trailhead is old and overgrown, and the route down into the gorge was narrow and covered in loose shale and fallen pine needles. Most people who knew about it stayed away, not because it was dangerous exactly, though it could be, but because it didn't offer anything flashy. No epic waterfalls or scenic overlooks. No signs. No other people. Just woods. Thick, heavy, dead quiet woods. That's exactly why I picked it. I drove in early on a Thursday morning. I left the rental car about 2 miles from the trailhead because the dirt road was in terrible shape, washed out in places, full of mud holes and exposed roots. I slung on my pack, locked the car, and started walking. The air was dry and clean, and it smelled like pine sap and cold moss. My pack was about 40 pounds, lighter than I used to carry, since gear has gotten better over the years. I had everything I needed: tent, stove, sleeping pad, GPS, emergency beacon, backup maps, extra food. I wasn't going in blind. By the time I hit the trailhead, it was just after 10 a.m. The entrance was barely marked. A bent aluminum sign hung on a split post that leaned like a broken tooth. Most of the trail was downhill from there. The forest closed in tight, and the light dimmed as the tree canopy thickened. It felt exactly like I wanted it to. Quiet, cold, far away from everything. I hiked about 7 miles that first day. I didn't see a single other person, not even footprints in the dirt. The trail curved and dipped until I reached the gorge itself. It wasn't a canyon, just a narrow crease in the land, steep-walled and thick with trees, maybe 500 feet lower than the surrounding terrain. The whole place felt hollowed out. No wind, no birds, no animal tracks that I could find. Even the insects were few. It was the kind of place you could yell in and not hear an echo. Perfect, I thought. I set up camp on a flat shelf near a bend in a dry stream bed. It looked like water had once carved through the rock there, but hadn't flowed in a long time. There were no fire rings or man-made debris. The spot was maybe 50 feet from the trail and surrounded on 3 sides by thick pine. It gave me cover, shade, and a little natural insulation. First night was uneventful, cold but calm. I made a simple dinner, drank tea, and sat against a log until it got dark. The stars came out through cracks in the trees. It had been a long time since I'd looked at stars like that, cold and sharp, like ice chips scattered across black glass. I fell asleep early, around 9 p.m., wrapped in my sleeping bag, with my bear canister about 30 yards away, sealed tight. Around 2 a.m., I woke up. I wasn't sure what had done it.
No dreams.
No sudden sound. I just opened my eyes, wide awake, heart beating hard like it had been running in my sleep. I lay there for a while, listening. Nothing. Total silence. Not even wind. I zipped the side of my bag down just a little to cool off and tried to go back to sleep. Then I heard it. Not a loud sound, just movement. A slow crunch far off. Something shifting in the dry leaves. At first, I thought it might have been a deer or maybe a raccoon nosing around my canister. But this wasn't the sound of sniffing or scratching. It was just walking. One step, another, then nothing, then 2 more steps, then silence again. What made it strange was the pacing. It didn't move like an animal. It didn't scurry. It didn't bolt when I shifted in my bag. It was like someone walking slowly, deliberately, pausing every few seconds, like they were trying to figure something out. And it wasn't getting closer. Not yet. Just walking near the edge of the trees. I sat up. I knew it could have been anything. My brain was just reacting to the quiet. When it gets that silent, your mind fills in blanks with things that aren't there. I'd experienced that before on solo trips, hearing things that end up being the wind or a squirrel that sounds bigger than it is. Still, I stayed up for about an hour just listening. Eventually, I must have dozed off. Next morning, I checked the area. No prints, no torn leaves, no scuff marks in the dirt. Nothing touched my gear. The bear canister was exactly where I left it. I tried to shake the nerves off, told myself it was probably a deer, maybe even my own breathing or heartbeat echoing weird in the cold air. I pushed deeper into the gorge that day, did another 5 miles with a day pack and came back to my base camp by late afternoon. Still hadn't seen a single person. No prints, no wrappers, no tire marks. I was completely alone. Again, that was what I wanted. But that night, it came back. Same time, a little after 2 a.m. The steps were closer this time. I didn't hear them approach. They just started up again like they'd been standing there the whole time. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. I stayed still inside my bag, barely breathing. My tent walls felt paper thin. The steps circled halfway around my site. Still slow, still spaced out. Then they stopped, right outside. I didn't move. There was no zipper sound, no rustling, nothing that would say animal. Just wait, presence. Like something big was right outside the tent, not moving. I could feel it. 10 minutes passed, 15, nothing. Then I heard the steps again, moving away, fading back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't gonna panic and leave, but I wanted to move my camp. If it was a bear, I figured maybe it had marked that area. If it was a person, which I doubted but couldn't totally rule out, I didn't like the idea of being predictable. So I packed up and moved 2 miles up the gorge, cut off the main trail, and found a spot up on a rocky slope surrounded by boulders and thick brush. No clear access. It took effort to get to, which meant less chance something or someone would just wander in. I stayed there 2 more nights. The first night, everything was quiet. The second night, not so much. This time, it started just before midnight. There was no walking, no circling, just a scrape, long and slow, like something being dragged across stone. It echoed up from the base of the rocks. Then silence. Then another scrape. I sat up in the tent, heart pounding. I had no idea what could have made that sound. It wasn't natural. It didn't have rhythm. It sounded like metal on stone or maybe wood. But there was no wind, no storm, just that dry scrape, then nothing. I unzipped my tent slowly and stuck my head out. The moon was half full and I could see a decent amount. The trees swayed just slightly and the shadows looked normal. Then I saw it. Not clearly, but enough. Something was at the edge of the rocks, maybe 50 feet away. A shape, human-sized, standing still. No light, no movement. I stared for a long time, trying to tell if it was a tree or a shadow. Then it moved. Just a tilt, a shift of weight. I ducked back in and grabbed the knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. I didn't move for hours. The shape never came closer. By the time the sky started to lighten, it was gone. I packed at sunrise and started hiking out. I moved fast, only stopped twice for water and snacks. I made it 10 miles back toward the trailhead by late afternoon and set up camp one last time. Not because I wanted to, but because my legs were shot. I figured one more night, then I'd hike the rest in the morning and be done. That final night was the worst. I didn't sleep at all. I didn't even lie down. I sat upright with my back against a tree, watching the dark. I kept thinking about how that shape just stood there, how it didn't make a sound, how it didn't run, like it didn't care if I saw it or not. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood go cold. I was never the kind of person who sought out danger for fun. I liked peace, quiet, solitude. That's what first got me into hiking and camping. Being out in the woods felt like a clean break from the world. No phones, no cars, no pressure. Just trees, sky, and earth. That year, I had taken some time off work and planned a solo trip deep into the northern part of Idaho, somewhere far away from the usual trailheads and weekend backpackers. I had scouted the place online for weeks. It was called Bear Ridge, though oddly, there were very few bear sightings in the last decade. Most people ignored the area because it was hard to reach and there weren't any famous views or waterfalls. That was perfect for me. I didn't want crowded campsites or loud hikers with Bluetooth speakers. I wanted real silence, that thick, heavy kind you can only find miles from the nearest road. I parked my truck at a Forest Service lot around noon and hiked for most of the day, crossing overgrown trails and pushing past dense underbrush. My pack was heavy, heavier than it should have been because I packed conservatively. Satellite phone, first aid kit, extra food, 2 knives, bear spray, tarp, sleeping bag, all the essentials. I wasn't careless. I double-checked everything the night before. If anything went wrong, it wouldn't be from lack of planning. The first night was calm. I set up camp near a small creek. The water was cold, fast, and clean. I boiled it anyway. I ate freeze-dried beef stew and watched the sun slip behind the pines, feeling the cold sneak in like it always does in the mountains. The forest was quiet, like it had something to hide, but I didn't feel nervous. That kind of quiet I was used to. I zipped up my bag, turned off my headlamp, and slept like I always do on the first night, lightly and with one ear open. The next morning, I packed up and moved deeper in. I followed a faint game trail, barely visible, cutting through a dense patch of lodgepole pine. There were signs of elk, fresh droppings, some fur stuck on the bark. I didn't see or hear anyone all day. That's how I knew I was in the right place. Real solitude. By the second night, I made camp on a small rise that overlooked a valley. You couldn't see much past the treetops, but I liked having the higher ground. I dug a small fire pit, made a ring of rocks, and boiled water for another bag meal. The woods felt thicker here, darker even during the day. There was a strange stillness that didn't sit right, but I chalked it up to nerves. Sometimes your gut lies to you out there. That night, I heard something. At first, it was faint. Twigs snapping far off, maybe 100 yards away. I turned off my headlamp and just sat in the dark, listening. Could have been anything. Deer, maybe an elk. I've heard bears crash through branches before, and this wasn't that. This was slower, more careful, like it didn't want to be heard. I didn't panic. I've dealt with wildlife plenty of times. I kept the bear spray close, set a perimeter with some tin cups and tied cord around the site, just in case something got curious. After about 20 minutes, the sound stopped. Nothing touched my camp. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. Every rustle had my eyes wide open. The next morning, I found a print about 30 feet from my tent. It was faint, in the soft mud near the edge of the ridge. Not a paw print, a boot print. Not mine. Someone had been there. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't seen any hikers. I had gone completely off trail. It didn't make sense. The print looked old, worn tread, maybe a work boot or something like that, but the edges were still clean. Too clean to be more than a day old. I kept calm. No use panicking. People cross paths in the woods all the time. Maybe someone else had the same idea. I ate a fast breakfast, packed up camp, and moved on. I didn't want to meet whoever had been out there. Not because I thought they were dangerous, but because that wasn't what I came for. I moved deeper into the woods, following a dry creek bed for a few miles, until I found another spot to set up camp. This one was hidden well, surrounded by thick brush on 3 sides, a tall rock outcropping on the 4th. You couldn't see it unless you were practically on top of it. That night was colder, the kind of cold that makes your teeth chatter even with layers on. I wore my thermal gear, slept in my bag with the liner, and still shivered. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I realized I couldn't hear anything. Not the wind, not the bugs, not the trees creaking, just dead silence. Then I heard the click. It was faint, metal on metal, like a buckle or a clasp. Came from outside the tent. I stayed still. My heart was pounding. I reached slowly for the knife I kept tucked next to the sleeping bag. I didn't unzip the bag. I just waited. The sound didn't come again. After 10 minutes, I forced myself to open the tent flap just enough to peek. I didn't see anything. My tin cup and cord setup was still in place. Nothing disturbed, but I didn't sleep again. The next morning, I did something I never do. I cut the trip short. I packed up and started hiking back toward the truck. I didn't run. I didn't rush, but I didn't stop either. I made it about halfway back before dusk. I didn't want to camp that night, but I had no choice. I wasn't close enough to make it before dark, and hiking in the dark is a great way to twist an ankle or get lost, even with GPS. I made camp in a hurry. No fire, no tarp. I just rolled out the sleeping bag under a tree and stayed low. I didn't cook. I didn't even eat. I just lay there with the knife in my hand, heart beating fast, waiting for the night to pass. I didn't hear anything for a long time. Then, around midnight, I saw it. Not an animal, a man. He was standing maybe 50 feet away, half hidden behind a tree. No flashlight, no gear, just standing, watching. His outline was dark, but the moonlight caught him just enough. He didn't move for maybe a full minute. I stayed completely still, pretending I was asleep. Then he walked away, not toward me, just off into the trees. I stayed awake until dawn. The second there was light, I was up and moving. I didn't stop to eat or drink. I hiked fast, fueled by adrenaline. I made it back to the truck by early afternoon. The whole time, I kept glancing back, scanning the woods, checking for movement. I didn't see him again. Back at the lot, there were only 2 other cars. One looked abandoned, flat tires, moss on the bumper. The other was an old green SUV. Dirty, no plates, windows blacked out. Something about it felt wrong. I got in my truck, locked the doors, and drove until I hit cell service. I didn't call the police. What would I say? A man stood in the woods and watched me? I had no proof. No crime was committed. I didn't even get a good look at him. Still, the feeling didn't go away. When I got home, I went through my gear. Everything was there, except one thing. My folding saw. It was a cheap one. Orange plastic handle, nothing special, but I remembered packing it. I used it to cut kindling the first night. It was gone. Not lost. Someone had taken it from my pack. There was no reason for it to fall out on its own. That's when it hit me. The click I heard that night, that was the sound of the saw folding closed. I remembered it, that distinct snap when it locks shut. Someone had been in my camp, close enough to open my pack, close enough to take something, close enough to watch me sleeping. I still don't know what they wanted. Maybe nothing. Maybe they were just curious. Or maybe they were waiting for something. A moment I was distracted, vulnerable, alone. I think back to the boot print, the green SUV, the missing saw. I think about the way he just stood there, half hidden, watching. No light, no movement, just patience. I've gone on other trips since then, but never alone. I don't camp more than a mile off a trail. I always tell someone exactly where I'll be, and I carry a camera now. A little trail cam that records silently through the night. It's not the wilderness I'm afraid of anymore. It's the people who hide in it, and how quiet they can be. I took a solo trip into Little Bear Canyon in early October, just as the leaves were starting to change and the mornings were crisp enough to sting your nose. I picked that area because it wasn't too far from civilization but remote enough that I wouldn't be bumping into weekend hikers. It was located in southern Utah, not as well known as some of the other national parks, but it had its own charm, red sandstone walls, dry creek beds that wound through tight slots, and long silences broken only by wind or your own footsteps. I needed that silence. I had just come off a bad month. Work had gone sideways, a relationship ended, and the noise in my head wouldn't quiet down no matter how much I tried. I figured a few days alone in the desert, away from everything, would help. That was the plan. I planned the route carefully. I wasn't an amateur at this. I'd done dozens of solo backpacking trips. I carried a Garmin with SOS capability, printed maps, extra food, plenty of water, and even water filters in case I came across any muddy puddles. I left a detailed itinerary with my brother, who lived in Phoenix. I told him I'd check in via satellite text every evening and return to my truck by Sunday noon. I parked the truck just off a dusty access road, miles from any town. The canyon entrance was marked with a weathered BLM sign and nothing else. It wasn't an official trailhead. I shouldered my 45-pound pack, locked the truck, and started the descent into the canyon. The first day was uneventful. The canyon floor was dry and soft, scattered with pebbles and patches of dry sage. The walls closed in gradually as I moved deeper. At times, the sandstone curved inwards so tightly I had to take off my pack to squeeze through. I didn't see a single person or even a boot print in the sand. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to feel alone. I found a flat patch near a dried river bend and pitched my tent as the light faded. The temperature dropped fast after the sun went down. and I bundled up in my sleeping bag, breathing slow to match the silence around me. I turned off my headlamp and let the dark wrap around me like a blanket. That first night was peaceful. On the second day, I headed further in, aiming to reach a narrow slot canyon called Twin Cuts. It wasn't on the main maps, but I'd found references to it on a few hiker blogs. Deep cuts in the rock where two water channels had eroded through the sandstone and eventually merged. I moved slowly, enjoying the way the morning light bounced off the walls. I took photos, ate jerky and trail mix, drank water conservatively. But as I moved deeper into the slots, I started getting this weird sense of unease. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. It was just too quiet. I stopped walking and listened. No wind, no insects, no birds. I told myself it was normal. Fall in the desert meant less animal activity, and the canyon walls blocked wind pretty well. Still, I started noticing little things that made me slow down. At one point, I came across a shredded backpack. It was tucked behind a boulder, half buried under dust. The straps were torn, not cut. There was a dry, sun-bleached shirt tangled in one of the zippers. No gear, no ID, just the pack. I stared at it for a long time, thinking maybe it had washed down during a flash flood and got stuck there. But the fabric wasn't water damaged. It looked clawed, like something had been chewing at it. I pushed on, deciding I'd take a different route back. The canyon was narrow, but I had marked a few exit points on my map where I could scramble out and take the high route if I wanted to avoid the slots. That second night, I set up camp near a cluster of boulders that offered some wind cover. I still hadn't seen anyone all day. I ate a freeze-dried meal, checked in with my brother using the Garmin, and crawled into my tent. The stars above were bright enough to see without a flashlight. I tried to enjoy the silence, but something about it felt heavy now. I didn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It was soft, distant, like pebbles shifting. I held my breath, then silence. I figured it might be a small animal, maybe a coyote or a ringtail. Still, I stayed still for a while, listening. Then I heard it again. This time, it was closer. A soft, steady crunch. Not random, not animal-like. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps on loose gravel, but spaced too far apart to be a small creature. Too measured. And then it stopped again. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. My flashlight was in my hand, but I didn't turn it on. The moon gave me just enough light to see maybe 10 feet. Nothing moved. No wind. No shadows. Just the canyon wall and the outline of the boulders. Eventually, I lay back down, zipped the tent shut, and stared at the ceiling until the sky turned pale. The next morning, I packed up early and started back. I took the alternate route I'd mapped out, scrambling up a side ledge that led to a wide plateau. It was harder on the legs, but I felt better being up high with open space around me. I followed the sandstone ridge north for several miles, checking my GPS regularly. But something wasn't adding up. Distances felt off. My position on the map didn't match what I was seeing. I'd pass a rock formation that should have been behind me. I thought maybe I'd miscalculated my pace, or the terrain had shifted since the last time someone updated the satellite maps. Around mid-afternoon, I found a strange marker. It was a pile of rocks, like a cairn but taller than normal, about chest high, and on top of it was a torn piece of canvas, wrapped tightly around a stick and tied off with a piece of paracord. It looked like a makeshift flag, but it had no color, no pattern, just dirty, sun-bleached fabric. That's when I realized it wasn't just random. Someone had made this. Recently, I checked my GPS again. Still wrong. My dot was floating somewhere to the west of where I actually was. I decided to descend again into the canyon to get back on track. There was a steep gully that seemed manageable, so I lowered myself down using a small rope and slid the last 10 feet. My boots hit the canyon floor, and I felt this deep, empty stillness settle around me again. The kind that makes your ears ring from the lack of sound. As I walked forward, I saw more signs. Old gear, tent poles, a cracked plastic water bottle, a broken headlamp, all scattered in the brush like someone had tossed them from a pack. I bent down to examine the headlamp. The battery case was cracked open. The wires inside looked chewed. Then I saw the boot print. Not mine. It was about my size, but with a different tread pattern. Recent. Maybe a day old. Maybe less. I pointed down the canyon. Same direction I was heading. I followed it. I shouldn't have. By dusk, the canyon twisted into a fork. One branch was narrow and overgrown. The other was wider but steeper. I chose the wider one. The boot prints followed that path too. They were getting fresher. I started noticing other marks. Scuffs on rocks, broken branches, disturbed dust. Someone was ahead of me. I didn't know if I wanted to catch up to them. I told myself I didn't, but I kept following. Just before dark, I found what I thought was a makeshift campsite. There were fresh ashes in a fire pit. Not warm, but not ancient either. A burned can of beans, still black with soot, lay nearby. No tent, no sleeping pad, just the fire pit and some trash. But here's what really messed with me. Next to the fire was a pile of animal bones. Not scattered, arranged. I stared at them for a long time. They were lined up by size. Spine, ribs, skull fragments. Probably jackrabbit or something similar, but I'm no biologist. What made it worse was how clean they were. Picked dry, not broken. I didn't set up camp that night. I moved down the canyon another half-mile and camped in a patch of brush, hidden from the main route. I didn't cook dinner. I didn't turn on my light. I just crawled into my bag, clutching the Garmin, and waited. At around 11 p.m., I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, crunching on gravel. Slow, steady, then a pause, then another step, just one, then nothing. I lay there in my bag, sweating despite the cold. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. The sound didn't come back, but I didn't sleep. By morning, I was rattled. I packed my gear in 5 minutes and started moving. I didn't eat, I didn't check my bearings. I just moved north, hoping to find a way out of the canyon and back toward the truck. But I was deeper in than I thought. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, because by midday I reached a dead end, high canyon walls on all sides, no visible exit. The only way was back. That's when I heard a sound behind me, a sharp, deliberate noise, metal on stone. I turned around. Nothing, but something was different. There was a figure standing at the far end of the canyon, maybe 50 yards away. Motionless, just standing there. I froze. My chest locked up. The figure didn't move. It was a weekend trip I had been planning for months. I wanted to get away from everything. The city noise, the endless emails, the screens that seemed to have taken over every waking moment. My plan was simple. A solo camping trip in a remote forest I had never visited before. Somewhere deep enough that the only sounds were wind through the trees and the occasional bird call. I packed carefully. A sturdy tent, a sleeping bag rated for the cold nights I expected, enough food for 3 days, a portable stove, a first aid kit, and a small but sharp folding knife. I made sure my phone was fully charged, though I didn't expect to get a signal once I was past the trailhead. I also brought a headlamp and extra batteries. The weather forecast said clear skies with low humidity, perfect for camping. I drove for about 4 hours to reach the trailhead early on a Friday morning. The road to the trailhead was rough, but manageable with my old SUV. I parked in a small dirt lot where maybe 5 other cars were scattered around. It was early enough that not many people had started their trips yet. The trail started as a narrow path winding between thick trees, the ground covered in fallen leaves and patches of moss. It was quiet except for my boots crunching the dry foliage. I had read a few reviews online that warned about bears and coyotes, but nothing that seemed too worrying. Still, I kept my bear spray handy. I hiked for about 3 hours, gradually ascending a ridge. The forest here was dense. Towering pine and spruce trees, their trunks thick and dark. The scent of pine needles filled the air. As I climbed higher, the temperature dropped slightly. I was sweating under my pack, but enjoyed the challenge. Around noon, I found a small clearing about halfway up the ridge. The spot was perfect. a flat patch of ground with soft grass and some fallen logs I could use for seating or a fire ring. I decided to stop here for lunch and rest a bit. I pulled out my water bottle, ate a granola bar, and just soaked in the silence. I noticed something odd but didn't think much of it then. There were no bird songs here. Usually, in the middle of the day, birds are busy chirping and flying around. But this clearing was eerily quiet, not a single flutter or whistle, just the occasional rustling of the wind through the leaves. I shrugged it off and continued. After another hour, I reached the top of the ridge where I planned to set up camp. The spot was more open, with a decent view down the valley below. The trees here were more scattered, and the ground was rocky but manageable. I unpacked and set up my tent on a flat spot shielded by a few bushes. It took some time to get the tent staked down properly against the wind. I was careful to position the entrance facing away from the valley to avoid any strong gusts blowing directly inside. Once the tent was up, I gathered some dry wood for a fire. The ground here was littered with pine needles and fallen branches. I arranged a small fire pit using some stones I found nearby. The thought of a warm fire made me feel better, even though the sun was still up. The sky was clear blue, and the sun was just beginning to lower behind the distant mountains. I cooked some dehydrated food on my stove and ate slowly, savoring the quiet and the view. Then I started a small fire. The flames crackled and popped, sending a faint orange glow into the darkening forest. I sat close to the fire for a while, feeling the warmth and watching the smoke spiral up into the sky. The silence was still unnerving. Even the animals seemed to have disappeared. No birds, no insects, no rustling small mammals. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Night fell quickly. The stars appeared, bright and clear, unpolluted by city lights. I lay down inside my tent, zipped up tight against the cold. I kept the fire smoldering but low, just enough to keep some warmth near the campsite. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. The wind had picked up outside, and the tent fabric was flapping softly. But more than that, I heard something else. A faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. Slow and steady, coming from the direction of the ridge behind my tent. I froze. The sound didn't stop. It moved closer, pausing occasionally, then continuing. I reached for my headlamp but held back from turning it on immediately. I tried to listen carefully. The footsteps seemed too heavy to be a deer or a small animal. But whatever it wasn't making the erratic noises that animals usually make when they're moving around at night. I debated what to do. I had my knife, but that was no real defense against anything larger. The bear spray was still in my pack, but the idea of fumbling with it in the dark terrified me. I stayed still, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might wake me. Then, for what felt like minutes, there was only silence. I could hear my own breath, shallow and fast. Then, suddenly, the sound of something heavy pushing against the side of my tent. My adrenaline spiked. I gripped my knife, ready to stab at whatever might burst through. But the tent didn't tear. Instead, I heard a low, guttural growl. It was close, so close I felt the heat of the breath through the thin fabric. I realized it had to be a large animal, maybe a bear or a mountain lion. But bears usually didn't growl like that. Mountain lions were more silent stalkers. Whatever it was curious, maybe hungry, and definitely dangerous. I stayed perfectly still, not daring to move or make a sound. The growl faded, replaced by a low snuffling noise. Then the footsteps retreated slowly, crunching again on the dry leaves. I waited, barely daring to breathe, until the noises faded entirely. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep much. Every little sound made me jump. I kept my knife close and my headlamp on the lowest setting, just enough to see inside the tent. At first light, I unzipped the tent carefully and peered outside. The fire was dead, cold ashes. The clearing looked the same, peaceful in the soft morning sun. But then I noticed something. Right beside my tent, the ground was disturbed. Paw prints, huge ones, pressed deeply into the soil. They circled around the tent, sometimes near the entrance, sometimes on the opposite side. like the animal had been inspecting every inch of my small camp. I took pictures with my phone for reference, then packed up quickly. I didn't want to stick around longer than necessary. The hike back was tense. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves put me on edge. The silence from the previous day was still there. No birds, no small animals, nothing moving except me. I made it back to the trailhead by late afternoon, exhausted and still shaken. When I got to my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a long time, heart still racing. I reported the incident to the local ranger station the next day. They confirmed that bears were active in the area but said attacks were rare. They also suggested that the quiet forest could have been a sign that the animals had already fled the area or were staying hidden due to a nearby predator. Weeks later, I researched similar reports. Other hikers had noticed strange animal behavior in that same forest. Sudden silence, large prints, and unusual animal noises at night. Some experts suggested it might have been a big male bear protecting its territory, possibly with cubs hidden nearby. That would explain the cautious but aggressive behavior. The experience stayed with me. It wasn't the kind of horror story you hear in movies with monsters or ghosts, but it was real and raw. Being out there, alone and vulnerable, surrounded by nature that could turn deadly at any moment, reminded me how small and fragile we really are. I never went back to that forest. Not because of fear alone, but because it taught me respect for the wild, for the unknown, and for the power of silence. I went out there to be alone. That was the entire point. I wasn't trying to find myself or test my limits or any of that dramatic crap people say when they disappear into the woods for a week. I just wanted quiet, space. Something separate from concrete, cars, coworkers, and the constant buzz of my phone. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, only that I'd be gone for a while. I had the gear, I had the experience, and I had a spot. A patch of federal land just past the old logging roads near Mount Sterling in North Carolina, off the beaten path and quiet. I'd camped out there once before for just a night, and I remembered it being peaceful. This time I packed for 5 days. It would be my reset. I parked my car a little past the last ranger turnoff, a dirt pullout barely wide enough for a single car, marked by an old forestry sign half-rotted and leaning. From there, it was about a 2-hour hike to the area I remembered. The trailhead wasn't marked on any app. It was something I'd come across by accident before. I found the faint start of the trail and began walking, crossing over a small creek within the first 20 minutes. The forest thickened after that. Old pine and hardwood mixed together, branches low, ground dry and soft from years of untouched leaf litter. Every now and then I saw old stumps, remnants from logging maybe 40, 50 years ago, but nature had started taking all of it back. Moss ran up the trunks, and you could barely tell where the trail started to fade into nothing. I reached the clearing around 3 p.m. It was smaller than I remembered, maybe 20 feet across, but surrounded by tall trees and nestled just beside a rock outcropping that curved around one side like a half bowl. The place looked undisturbed. No fire rings, no wrappers, no broken branches or unnatural trash. That was good. I didn't want to camp somewhere people might come stumbling into looking for a shortcut. I set up my tent on the far side of the clearing where the ground felt flat and the soil soft but dry. I had a lightweight tarp too, which I strung between 2 trees as a kind of extra shelter for gear. I collected wood, set up a small fire ring using old stones I found nearby, and got the stove going. I didn't plan to cook much over the fire except maybe water or a simple boil-in-bag meal or 2. Most of my food was calorie-dense and easy to prepare. I had it all in a bare canister which I stored a good distance from the tent, wedged under a rock shelf near the trees. I always did this. Even if there were no signs of bears, I wasn't going to take a chance. The first night passed quietly. I read a bit, watched the shadows stretch and fade, heard birds fluttering through the trees and small animals skittering over dry leaves. A few times I thought I heard twigs snap in the distance, but nothing close enough to worry about. I chalked it up to deer or raccoons. The forest is full of noise, and you learn to ignore most of it. I slept fine. The second day, I hiked further up into the hills behind the outcropping. I wasn't trying to get lost, just looking for views, maybe a spot to journal or just sit. The terrain got rough after about half a mile. Steep ridges with loose soil, thorny undergrowth that tugged at my pants. I saw an old animal trail, barely used, cutting along one ridge and followed it for a bit. I found a deadfall. This huge tree, probably decades old, toppled over with its root ball still half suspended. It had fallen in such a way that it opened a small pocket beneath it, like a cave. There were old bones scattered nearby, nothing fresh. Likely deer, maybe something smaller. I moved on. By the time I got back to camp, it was nearly dark. My legs were cut in a few places from bramble and I was starving. I grabbed the canister, made dinner, and ate in silence as the sun dipped. That night felt colder. The wind came through from the north, and the trees made this low moaning sound as they swayed. I woke up sometime after midnight to the wind slapping the side of my tent. I lay there for a while listening. Nothing else stood out, just the breeze and the rustling. Day 3 is when it started to go wrong. I woke up and walked to where I'd stored the canister, but it wasn't there. At first, I figured maybe I'd misremembered where I placed it, but after 20 minutes of combing the area around the rock ledge, I started to worry. It wasn't just missing, it was gone. No claw marks, no scratches on the ground, no drag path, just gone. I expanded my search another 30 feet in every direction, checking behind trees and under shrubs. Nothing. I don't panic easy, but food is your lifeline out here. I had a bit stashed in my day pack. Some jerky, trail mix, a few bars, but not enough to last 3 days. Still, I figured I'd ration and make it work. That was the plan. Later that day, while sitting at the edge of the clearing journaling, I noticed something odd about the path leading back toward the car. It looked off, not like it had been disturbed, but like something was missing. A low-hanging branch I ducked under was snapped off completely, fresh wood visible at the break. There were boot prints too, not mine. Too wide, too deep. I crouched over them and stared for a long time. It hadn't rained, so the prints held their shape well. The tread didn't match mine. I knew I hadn't passed anyone coming in, and if someone else had hiked out this far, I would have heard them. The forest isn't that quiet, and my clearing isn't easy to stumble on. I circled camp again, looked for signs, didn't find much, but something about that broken branch, those prints, and the missing canister all added up to a feeling I didn't like. Someone was out here, watching maybe, and they hadn't made themselves known. That night I didn't sleep well. Every gust of wind felt louder, sharper. I thought I heard footsteps twice but couldn't be sure. I stayed zipped up in my bag, knife nearby, just listening to the black silence pressing in from all sides. Nothing happened, but I didn't sleep. The next morning I made a decision. I cut the trip short and head back. It wasn't worth it. I was low on food, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was around. Someone who didn't want to be seen. I packed up slowly, methodically. I didn't leave anything behind. I left the fire ring intact, just in case I ever came back. By 11 a.m., I was hiking back down the path toward my car. I had my pack fully loaded, everything tied down, bear spray clipped to my belt. About a mile into the hike, I found something that stopped me cold. My bear canister, just sitting in the middle of the path. It hadn't been opened or damaged. The lid was sealed tight, and it didn't even look scratched. But it had clearly been placed there, deliberately, and not just tossed. It was sitting upright, like someone had positioned it neatly. I stood over it for a long time, heart hammering. That canister had been missing for 2 days. There was no way it just ended up here by accident. I scanned the trees, turning in a slow circle, eyes darting between trunks and branches. No sound, no movement, just me and the forest. I picked it up, slid it into my pack, and kept walking. My pace was faster now, controlled but faster. I didn't stop for water, didn't rest. I just wanted to get back to the car and get out. When I reached the pullout, my car was there, but something was off. The passenger door was slightly ajar, just a crack. My stomach dropped. I approached slowly. The door wasn't forced, just opened. I checked the back, nothing missing. glove box untouched. But on the passenger seat was a single item that hadn't been there when I left. A small piece of deer antler. Smooth, old, placed dead center on the seat. I didn't sit. I didn't think. I got in, locked the doors, and started the car. I drove until I hit cell service, pulled into a gas station, and just sat for 10 minutes trying to calm down. I never saw anyone. Not once. Not even a shadow. But someone was out there, watching me, moving through the woods in silence. They took my canister, left no tracks except for those prints, placed the canister back later, entered my car somehow, left a token. I still don't understand why. Nothing was stolen. They didn't confront me. They didn't try to hurt me. It was all quiet, precise, and intentional, like a message or a test. Maybe I stumbled into someone's territory without knowing it. Maybe it was a hunter, or someone living off-grid who didn't want their presence known. Or maybe it was just someone twisted, playing games with strangers for fun. I'll never know, but I'll never go back to that spot again. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. I had planned this trip for months. It was supposed to be a quiet solo escape into the northern woods of Michigan. I wasn't running from anything dramatic. I wasn't heartbroken, recently divorced, or fed up with the world. I just wanted to be alone in nature, disconnected from the constant hum of everyday life, the kind of solitude that feels like a reset. No phone, no work, no noise, just trees, dirt, and time. I picked an area near the Huron National Forest. There was an old state forest access road, marked on some outdated maps, that I knew would lead far from the usual trails. I wanted to go deep, miles off-grid, into areas where no one just stumbles in. I had the gear: backpack, ultralight tent, water purifier, freeze-dried meals, emergency beacon, and enough experience to know what I was doing. I wasn't careless. I double-checked everything. I parked my truck at the end of a muddy service road that barely showed up on satellite view. There were no signs, no rangers, no gates. I locked it, slung my pack over my shoulders, and stepped off into the trees. It was early October, the air just starting to carry that crisp bite of fall. The leaves were a mosaic of orange, gold, and fading green. Squirrels rustled through dry underbrush, and somewhere deeper in the woods I heard the slow knock of a woodpecker. I felt completely at ease. I walked for about 5 hours that first day, following deer paths and ridges. I kept my bearings with a compass and topo map. Again, no trails here. By late afternoon, I found a solid place to set up camp. There was a small clearing on the side of a hill, dry and mostly flat, surrounded by thick trees that broke the wind. I pitched my tent, hung my bear bag high in a pine, boiled water for dinner, and sat against a log eating macaroni and tuna from a pouch. Not gourmet, but it hit the spot. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the temperature dipped quickly. I wrapped myself in my jacket, watched the shadows grow long, and eventually crawled into my tent. I remember feeling how quiet it was. Not unnerving, just still. No cars, no voices, no artificial light. The last thing I heard before sleep was the whisper of leaves shifting in the wind. The first night passed without anything strange. I woke up a couple times to stretch or adjust my sleeping pad, but nothing felt off. In the morning, I heated water for coffee, walked to a small stream a few hundred yards away, and refilled my bottles. I sat on a fallen log for a while, watching a hawk circle above the treetops. Then I broke camp and moved further northeast, wanting to get closer to a bluff I'd seen on satellite images, somewhere with a view. I walked most of that day. The forest changed slowly, denser in some parts, then opening into small meadows. I crossed a dry creek bed littered with old animal tracks, mostly deer, maybe a bobcat. The deeper I went, the less I felt any sign of humans. Not a single wrapper, boot print, or broken bottle. No trail markers, no fire rings, just woods. By late afternoon, I reached the bluff. It wasn't dramatic, but it rose a good 100 feet above the surrounding forest. You could see the tops of trees roll for miles like a sea of leaves. I set up camp again, this time on firmer ground, with a bit of a view through the thinning leaves. I cooked chili this time, mixing in some dried beef jerky. It was warm and spicy, just what I needed. As night fell, I zipped into my tent and listened to the wind coming over the bluff. I fell asleep quickly. That's when things started to feel different. I woke around 2 a.m. to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was close. A dry, deliberate crack, like someone stepping on a thick twig. I stayed still. You hear animals all the time when camping, especially at night, and the last thing you want to do is panic over a raccoon or a wandering deer. But something about this sound was slow. It wasn't the clumsy crash of a bear or the rhythmic pace of a deer trotting. It was paced. One step, pause, another step. I held my breath, then silence. I lay there for what felt like forever. No more steps, just the soft sound of the wind and leaves shifting above me. Eventually, I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a porcupine. I rolled over and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The sky was overcast and gray, a little colder than the day before. I started boiling water for coffee and wandered a little around the camp. That's when I noticed it. About 20 feet from my tent, just at the edge of the clearing, I saw a partial boot print in the soft soil. Not mine. It was shallow, like someone had walked lightly, but it was clear enough. The tread didn't match my boots. I wear a kind of deep lug hiking boot. This print was smoother, maybe a work boot or lighter hiker. I stared at it for a long time. There was only one. I looked around. Nothing else. No trail of them. No other disturbance. Just that single print angled toward the camp. I told myself it might be old. Maybe someone came through here weeks ago. But the ground was damp from rain a few days earlier, and the print looked fresh. The edges hadn't crumbled or softened. It was recent. I didn't panic. I just packed up camp a little faster than usual. I didn't hear anything that whole day, but I kept looking over my shoulder. The woods felt different, less empty, more like something was always behind the trees, just out of sight. I decided not to hike deeper. Instead, I angled southwest, making a long loop back toward the old service road where I'd left my truck. I figured I'd take an extra day to get there, maybe camp once more before heading out. I wasn't in a full-blown fear mode, but the print had settled into the back of my mind like a weight. Couldn't shake it. I made about 8 miles that day and camped beside another small stream, deeper in a valley this time. The ground was soft with moss, and the trees were packed tightly. Felt more sheltered, more hidden. I didn't build a fire that night, just heated dinner on my stove and ate quietly. I didn't want to draw attention. I wasn't even sure from what. I slept lightly. Around 3 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it wasn't a single step. It was a soft rustling, like someone or something walking carefully through dry leaves. Not directly toward me, just nearby, circling. I didn't move. I just lay there, barely breathing. The sound came and went, sometimes fading into silence, then returning in another direction. Never loud, always slow, deliberate. Eventually, it stopped. In the morning, I found nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing that screamed presence. But I knew something had been there. I could feel it. I started hiking back toward my truck that morning. I was only about 10 miles out now. I figured I could make it by early evening if I pushed hard. I didn't eat much. My stomach was tight, knotted with unease. About 2 hours into my hike, I found something that stopped me cold. Hanging from a low branch just at eye level was a strip of orange cloth. Torn, faded. It looked like it had been there maybe a few days. The edge was frayed and dirty. It was the same kind of safety orange used on hunting vests or gear flags. But there was no hunting allowed in this area, and no one should have been out here. I hadn't heard a gunshot, a voice, or seen a soul in days. I stood there staring at it for a long time. Felt like a message. I left it where it was and kept walking. As the forest thinned slightly and the trail became easier, I started feeling like I was being watched. Every time I stopped, I'd hear something small, a twig, a shuffle. But when I turned around, there was nothing. I never saw anything, never caught movement, but I felt it. like eyes that disappeared the moment I looked. I finally reached the road where I'd parked. My truck was still there. Could have cried. I unlocked it, tossed my pack in the bed, and sat in the driver's seat with the doors locked. I just sat there for a few minutes, staring out the windshield, gripping the wheel. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the passenger side mirror, written in what looked like ash or grease, were the numbers. 7.4. I didn't understand it. It wasn't a date, not a coordinate, just two numbers spaced slightly apart. 7.4. I got out and checked the truck. No damage, no slashed tires, just that number. I wiped it off with my sleeve and drove. I didn't stop until I was 3 towns away. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. About a week later, back home, I was going through my gear to clean it up. I checked my topo maps and saw something that made everything twist in my gut. The location where I camped the first night, the one where I saw the boot print, on that map, drawn in pencil, faint and hard to see unless you looked closely, was a small note. 7.4 me from road. I hadn't written it. I don't know who did. It lined up roughly with where I'd camped. Whoever wrote that had measured the distance from the road I started on to that exact area. I've always liked solo camping trips. It sounds reckless, I know, but I've done enough of them to feel comfortable on my own in the woods. There's something quiet and clean about being out there without anyone else. Just you, the trees, and the sounds of the forest. No phones buzzing, no small talk, no planning your day around other people. You go when you want to go, eat when you're hungry, sleep when the fire dies down. I've done this enough to know how to handle myself. Keep food stored properly, always bring a topographic map and compass as backup, make notes about water sources, keep extra batteries for the headlamp. All that. Last October, I picked a spot in western North Carolina, not far from the Tennessee border. Nantahala National Forest. Not a marked campground, just a flat section I found a few miles off one of the less used trails. It was below 4,000 feet, just into the color change, with the forest glowing in shades of orange and red. Cold enough to need layers at night, but not freezing. No bears in the area that time of year either. Not really. And I didn't see any fresh signs of wildlife besides deer and raccoon tracks on the hike in. I had driven out early on a Friday morning and parked near a service road that had just enough space for one vehicle to tuck off to the side. From there, I hiked 5, maybe 6 miles out, mostly uphill, then cut off the trail near a rocky outcrop. I followed the slope down for maybe 15 more minutes until I found a spot that was flat and clear, just above a dry creek bed. It was a perfect little area, secluded, surrounded by tall hardwoods, and I could see from the way the land sloped that no water would pool if it rained. There was enough room to set up my tent, dig a fire pit, and hang a bear bag line. It looked like no one had camped there in years. No trash, no fire ring, no signs of people at all. Just quiet forest. The first day was easy. I set up camp, gathered firewood, and boiled water from a spring I passed about a quarter-mile back. I read a little, made some instant noodles, and just sat by the fire for a few hours as it got dark. I remember noticing how quiet it was. You get used to silence out there, but this was different. There weren't even birds after sunset, not even owls. Just wind through the trees and the occasional sound of branches snapping in the distance. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was just how it was in that part of the forest. Some areas feel more alive than others, and some just don't. You accept it. That night, I turned in around 10. The sleeping bag was warm, and I drifted off easily. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was full dark, middle of the night. My watch was buried somewhere in the side pocket, and I didn't feel like fishing it out. I lay still for a moment, trying to figure out what woke me. Then I heard it again. A sound, a soft thump. Not footsteps, not exactly. More like a single, deliberate stomp. And then another one, maybe 5 seconds later. It was uphill from me, maybe 20 yards off. Slow, heavy. Not a deer, not even a bear. Bears move with more urgency when they're walking. Whatever this was, it moved with slow, heavy intent. like it didn't care about making noise. I didn't move. I stayed in my sleeping bag, listening. There was a long pause after the second stomp, maybe 30 seconds. Then another sound, closer now. Another heavy step. Then a crack. A branch snapping under weight. Definitely not a small animal. And too deliberate to be wind or tree fall. I slid my hand over to my flashlight and waited. My tent was a small one-person, so I couldn't sit up all the way. I just lay there, staring up, barely breathing. The steps didn't continue. After that crack, it went silent again. Too silent. I waited, flashlight in hand, for at least an hour. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep again, because the next thing I remember was morning light coming through the tent fabric. I got up slowly and unzipped the tent, looking around. The forest looked exactly the same as before, quiet, still, and clean. I walked around the camp slowly. No tracks, no disturbed branches, no damage to my gear. My bear bag was still hanging untouched. The fire pit looked the same. Nothing obvious had changed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched that night. I know how paranoia works. I've had nights in the woods where the wind picks up and every branch crack sounds like footsteps. But this felt different. The weight of those steps, the timing, the pause. It had a rhythm to it that didn't feel random. That day, I stuck close to camp. I didn't want to head out on a long hike and come back to find something missing. I chopped more wood, made a small midday fire, and read until my eyes hurt. I kept looking up the slope where the sound had come from, watching for any movement. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to walk up that direction, just to see. Maybe I'd find a tree with a fresh scrape, or maybe a set of prints. Something to help me figure out what I heard. I followed a faint game trail up about 50 yards. Nothing obvious. Then I saw something that caught my attention. There was a rock about the size of a microwave half buried in the ground. On the side facing downhill, a section of moss had been scraped clean. Not just fallen off naturally. It was peeled in a rough circle, maybe 10 inches across, as if someone or something had scraped it off intentionally. The edge was uneven, almost clawed off. I crouched down to look closer. The bare rock underneath was scratched. Not deep, but enough that I could see 4 or 5 long gouges in the stone. I ran my fingers over them. They weren't natural. I didn't like that. I stood up and looked around again. Still nothing. The wind blew a few leaves down from the canopy, but the forest stayed quiet. No birds, no bugs. I turned and walked back to camp. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up at every small sound. A leaf falling, the wind shifting. Every noise felt too loud. I ended up just sitting in my sleeping bag for a long time with my flashlight on, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time it was from the opposite direction, downhill toward the dry creek bed. A soft scraping sound, then a pause, then a thud, then nothing. I waited a while, then quietly unzipped my tent and peeked out. The moon was up, and I could see the shapes of the trees, long shadows across the ground. I aimed the flashlight and swept it slowly. Nothing, just stillness. I slept with the light on after that. Not because I thought it would help, but because darkness just felt heavier somehow, like it pressed against the tent walls. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. I packed up slowly, keeping my head on a swivel. I kept thinking about those gouges on the rock, about the steps, the scrape. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't care. I just wanted to be away from it. As I packed the last of my gear and was about to break down the tent, I noticed something that stopped me cold. On the far side of the clearing, about 10 feet into the woods, was a pile of rocks that hadn't been there before. 5 stones, stacked on top of each other, perfectly balanced. Not natural. I know what natural rock piles look like. These had been placed carefully, and on the top stone, facing my camp, was a small, flat piece of wood, and carved into it rough, deep letters was a single word: stay. Not go away, not a warning, just stay. I stared at it for a long time. My stomach twisted. My skin went cold. I hadn't left camp the entire day before. No one could have built that without me seeing or hearing it. It hadn't been there when I went to sleep. Something had been watching me, close enough to move into the camp, close enough to build that. Quietly, deliberately, I broke down the tent in under 5 minutes. I didn't care about folding things or packing neatly. I stuffed everything into my pack and started back toward the trail. I kept my knife in one hand and bear spray in the other the whole hike out. That hike back felt 3 times as long. Every stick crack made me jump. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone or something on the trail, but there was never anything. I got back to the car just after noon, dumped my gear in the back seat, and drove without stopping until I hit the highway. Only when I was an hour from the trailhead did I start to feel like I could breathe again. I don't know what I heard out there, or who left that message. Maybe it was someone messing with me. Maybe it was some backwoods squatter or hunter trying to scare people off. But the way it all happened, the silence, the movements at night, the careful way that rock pile was built, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like an invitation, or worse, an instruction. I haven't been camping alone since. Not because I'm afraid of the woods. I'm not. I'm afraid of the kind of person who can move that quietly through the forest, stay hidden for 2 days, and carve a message inches from where I slept, without making a sound. And I think about that word sometimes. Why stay? Why not go? Why not leave? And if I had listened, if I had followed the command and stayed another night, what would have happened? I don't think it would have been another rock pile in the morning. I've done a fair share of camping trips over the years. I never thought I'd come close to a real nightmare out there in the woods. Not the kind of nightmare where something jumps out at you or ghosts or monsters, just the kind where things go wrong, and you realize how little control you actually have when you're alone in the wild. This story happened on a trip I took a couple of years ago. It was early fall, the kind of crisp, cool weather when the leaves start turning and the air smells sharp and clean. Perfect camping weather. I was backpacking alone on a popular trail that cuts through a big national forest. The trail itself was well marked and had plenty of campers, hikers, and backpackers passing through. I'd planned the trip for weeks, checked my gear carefully, and packed everything I thought I'd need. A sturdy tent, a good sleeping bag, water filter, food, first aid, and even some emergency gear like a whistle and a small flare. I was used to hiking alone. I liked the quiet, the solitude, the feeling of just being out there, away from everything. But this trip turned out to be unlike any other. I started the hike early in the morning, with the sun just barely over the horizon. The trailhead was busy with other hikers packing up, heading out, or just starting their day. I had about 20 miles to cover to reach my chosen campsite, a small clearing near a lake deep in the forest. It was supposed to be quiet, remote, but not too hard to find. The first half of the hike went smoothly. The trail was well maintained and easy to follow. The trees on either side were tall and thick, and every now and then I'd spot a deer or a squirrel. The sun rose higher, warming the air. I stopped a few times to drink water and eat small snacks. By early afternoon, I was nearing the lake. The trail got narrower and rockier, but nothing I hadn't dealt with before. I crossed a small stream on some slippery stones, careful not to lose my footing. The smell of wet earth and pine filled the air. When I got to the clearing by the lake, I was relieved. It was exactly what I expected. A small grassy area surrounded by trees, with the calm surface of the lake stretching out in front of me. I picked a spot for my tent, away from the water but close enough to hear the gentle lapping of the waves. Setting up camp was quick. I pitched my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and unpacked a bit of food. The sun was starting to drop low in the sky, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call and the rustle of leaves. I spent some time just sitting there, looking out over the water, feeling the calm settle in. I thought about how lucky I was to be there, away from the noise and rush of daily life. As darkness fell, I lit a small camp stove and heated up some dinner. The smell of food cooking filled the air, mixing with the scent of pine and damp earth. I ate slowly, enjoying the quiet and the taste of warm food after a long day of hiking. After dinner, I cleaned up carefully. I made sure to pack all my food and trash into my bear-proof container and stashed it far from my tent. I knew bears and other animals were a possibility in the area, and I didn't want to attract any unwanted attention. By the time I was done, the stars were out, clear and bright above the treetops. I sat outside the tent for a while, looking up at the sky. There was no moon that night, just a blanket of darkness pierced by countless stars. The silence was deep and complete, broken only by the sounds of the forest. It was peaceful. I zipped up the tent and climbed inside, laying down in my sleeping bag. I was tired but happy. That's when I first heard it. First, it was faint, a distant, slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled over rocks or sticks. It wasn't regular, and it didn't seem close. I listened, trying to figure out what it was. The forest was full of noises. Wind through the trees, animals moving around, leaves falling. But this sound was different. It wasn't natural. I told myself it was probably just a branch falling or some animal moving through the underbrush. I tried to ignore it, but the sound didn't stop. It got louder, closer. The dragging noise turned into a slow, deliberate scraping. I could hear the faint snap of twigs, the crunch of leaves. Something was coming toward my campsite. My heart started beating faster. I was alone out there. No other campers nearby. No one to help if something went wrong. I tried to stay calm. I remembered my training and what I'd read about being in bear country. No sudden moves. Don't run. Make yourself big and loud if the animal gets too close. But I wasn't sure what I was dealing with. The sound was too slow for a bear. It wasn't the normal sound of footsteps or an animal running. It was something dragging. I pulled out my flashlight and shone the beam out of the tent's small window. The light caught a figure moving slowly through the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. It was big, but hunched over, dragging something behind it. My mind raced. Was it a hunter? Someone else camping? I didn't have my phone signal out there, no way to call for help. I grabbed my whistle and my small hunting knife I always carried for emergencies. I kept the flashlight pointed at the figure. Stopped moving, just standing there at the tree line. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening to the forest. The dragging sound didn't come back, but my nerves were shot. I kept my knife close and my whistle ready. Every little noise made me jump. By morning, the sun was up, and the light made everything seem less threatening. I packed up quickly and started hiking out, wanting to get away from that place as fast as I could. I followed the trail back toward the trailhead. I wasn't in a rush, but didn't want to linger either. I kept glancing back into the trees, half expecting to see that figure again. I didn't see anything else unusual until I was almost back at the main road where I started. That's when I noticed something strange near the side of the trail. A backpack. It was old and dirty, lying on its side in the underbrush. I'd walked past it earlier and didn't see it. Now it was just there, half covered with leaves. I approached cautiously. I didn't know if it was dangerous or abandoned. I called out a few times, but there was no answer. I unzipped the pack slowly and looked inside. What I found chilled me. Inside were some old, torn clothes, a water bottle, and a small, beaten-up journal. The pages were damp and smudged, but I could make out some writing. The journal told a story of a man who had been lost in the forest for days. He'd been hiking alone, like me, but somewhere along the way he'd gone off the trail. His entries became more desperate as time passed. He wrote about running out of food and water, being cold and injured, hearing strange noises at night. His last entry was a scribbled note about someone following him, dragging something heavy through the woods. He said he was hiding but didn't know if he could last another night. The journal ended abruptly. I realized then that the figure I saw dragging something was probably the man from the journal, or whoever was following him. It was clear that he hadn't made it out. I took the backpack and the journal with me and hurried to the ranger station near the trailhead. I handed everything over and told them what I'd seen. They launched a search and rescue operation. A few days later, they found the remains of a man deep in the forest, near where I'd camped. It matched the description from the journal. Cause of death was exposure and injuries consistent with a fall. There were signs that someone had been dragging his body. Turns out, a man living off the grid in the area had come across the lost hiker, and instead of helping, he tried to capture him. The dragging noise I heard was this man moving the hiker's body after he'd died. The man was arrested and charged with several crimes. The whole thing was horrifying, but also a grim reminder that sometimes the real dangers in the woods aren't animals or ghosts. They're other people. Looking back, I still can't shake the feeling of how close I came to a real disaster. I was lucky. I had my wits about me, my gear, and the instinct to stay calm. That trip changed how I look at the woods. It's not just a place for peace and quiet. It's a place where you have to respect the unknown and be ready for anything. No fairy tales, no ghosts, just real danger, real fear, and the cold, hard truth that sometimes being alone in the wild means you're completely on your own. I've always been someone who enjoys getting away from people. Not in an antisocial way, just in that I like quiet. I like space. I like to think without the constant pressure of phones, noise, traffic, or random social obligations. So every once in a while, usually twice a year, I pick a spot out on a map, pack my gear, and hike out to some remote place to camp by myself for a couple of nights. I've been doing that for years now. Never had a problem. Until last September. This wasn't even supposed to be a big trip. Just 2 nights. A long weekend. I'd scouted a few places in a national forest a few hours from where I live. I found an area near a dry creek bed, about 5 miles off a trail that's mostly forgotten. It's not even marked on some newer hiking maps. I checked topography and satellite images to be sure the terrain wasn't too steep and that I could make camp without a problem. It looked like a perfect little clearing, surrounded by trees, a decent distance from any towns or roads. I didn't want to see another soul. I got my wish. The first day went smoothly. The trailhead was quiet, and I didn't see another car. I parked my truck at a small turnout, locked it, threw on my pack, and started walking. I brought enough food for 3 days, a filter straw and tablets for water, and I had my stove, my sleeping bag, my small tent, and my knife. All the normal gear. I've done enough of these to pack without overthinking it. By early afternoon, I was off the trail, moving carefully through scrub and broken forest. It was dry, but the forecast hadn't called for fires, and I wasn't planning on starting one anyway. I stopped around 4 p.m., found the clearing I'd seen on the map, and started setting up. It was better than I expected. Flat ground, soft pine needles, no big widowmakers overhead, and no signs of animals bedding there. I pitched my tent on the east side of the clearing and laid out my gear. Cooked some dried beans and rice on my little stove, ate, then sat back against a log and let the woods settle into that quiet hum they get around dusk. I always loved that part. It was around 8 when I finally crawled into the tent. I was a little sore from the hike, but not tired. I listened to the breeze, the occasional rustle of branches, maybe a squirrel or raccoon. At some point, I drifted off. I woke up once in the middle of the night. Not to a sound, just one of those moments where your body decides it's done sleeping for a bit. I lay there in the dark, staring at the faint green glow of my watch, 2:13 a.m., and just listened. I don't know how long I stayed like that, maybe 20 minutes, maybe more. At one point, I thought I heard something, a very soft crunch like footsteps, but it was far off and could have been a deer. The forest moves. I didn't think much of it. Eventually, I dozed off again. Day 2 started normally. I made oatmeal with a little instant coffee, then explored the area. I hiked a bit along the dry creek bed, collected some interesting stones, carved a little walking stick for fun. I didn't see any animals besides a few lizards. Around noon, I heard something big crash through the brush maybe 100 yards away. Probably a deer or elk, but I never saw it. I didn't like how quiet it was. That sounds weird. Quiet is what I go for, but this was different. There were no birds that day, not one. Just the occasional wind through the trees, but no chirping, no rustling of wings, not even the distant cry of a hawk. Is that wrong with me? You get used to the background noise of life when you spend time out here, and when it's missing, your body notices even if your brain doesn't know why. I kept trying to tell myself it was fine. I picked a dry, late-season weekend. Maybe the birds had moved on. Maybe it was just a quiet pocket. Maybe I was overthinking. But still, I didn't leave the clearing much after 3. Something about that place started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it. It was just unease. I sat closer to the tent than the previous night, sharpened my knife for no reason, and kept glancing at the tree line even though I couldn't say what I was looking for. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I tried, but I kept waking up. The wind was stronger, and a few times I thought I heard movement. Always faint, always just on the edge of hearing. I told myself it was wind in the trees, squirrels, a raccoon maybe, or an owl dropping down on prey. But there was one sound that didn't fit. Came around 1 a.m. A very slow, deliberate crunch. Not heavy, not fast. Just one footstep, then a pause, then another, then nothing. I held my breath for maybe a full minute, frozen under my sleeping bag, eyes wide, ears straining. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My heart was pounding. After a while, I convinced myself it had just been a falling branch or some animal. But I stayed awake the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my gear faster than I ever had before. I was supposed to stay one more night, but I decided I was done. The uneasy feeling hadn't gone away, it had gotten worse. I ate a protein bar on the move and didn't even heat coffee. I just wanted to get back to the trail and back to my truck. I kept looking over my shoulder, even though I didn't see anyone or anything. Just trees, brush, and the same quiet. I was about half a mile from where the old trail should have picked up again when I found something that stopped me cold. A boot print, not mine. I know what mine look like. These were newer, clearer, deeper. Someone had walked through that area either that morning or late the night before. The dirt was still loose in the tread marks, and they weren't following my trail, they were moving across it at a diagonal. I stood still for a long time, listening, watching. Nothing. I kept walking. A little faster, a little less carefully. I didn't care about being loud anymore. I just wanted to get out. I reached the old trail around noon and followed it back to the forest road where my truck was parked. That's when I knew something was really wrong. My truck had been moved. It wasn't a lot, just a few feet. The angle was off. I always park in line with the turnout, as close to the edge as possible. Now it was crooked. Not dramatic, but enough to notice. And there were faint marks in the dirt near the tires, like someone had walked around it. Maybe more than one person. I unlocked it, slid inside, and locked the doors. Nothing inside had been touched. My glove box was closed, and the keys were where I left them, hidden in the magnetic box under the back wheel well. That was the only reason I didn't call the cops right then. Nothing had been stolen, no damage, just moved. I turned the ignition and left. I didn't go home. I went straight to a diner 20 miles down the highway and sat inside for over an hour. Ordered coffee and just stared at the window, trying to sort through the noise in my head. None of it made sense. I hadn't seen anyone. I hadn't heard anyone during the day. No vehicles, no fires, no other camps. No wrappers or footprints or broken branches. But someone had been out there. I was sure of it. I went home and didn't unpack for 2 days. The gear sat in the garage like a box of rotten food I didn't want to touch. I didn't even wash the clothes right away. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like if I left them alone, the whole thing might feel less real. But then something else happened. A week later, I came home from work and found a piece of folded paper tucked into the crack of my front door. No envelope, no writing on the outside. I unfolded it and just stood there in my driveway, reading the single sentence written on it in blocky handwriting. You should pick better places to hide. That was it. No signature, no return address, just that sentence. My stomach turned cold. It was the kind of feeling you get when you realize you're not in control of something that matters, like a car sliding on ice. I called the police. They took it seriously, took the note, looked around the property, asked me about any enemies, recent arguments, break-ins. I told them everything. They wrote a report. That was all they could do. Nothing ever came of it. No fingerprints, no follow-up, just nothing. That was 9 months ago. I haven't gone camping since. Haven't even driven past that forest. Sometimes I still think about the print in the dirt, about the truck being moved, about the footsteps in the night, about that stupid piece of paper. I wonder if I was followed from the trailhead, or if someone was already out there watching that old clearing, waiting for someone to come along. I wonder if it was a warning or a game. And more than anything, I wonder how long they watched me. Because if someone left that note, it means they knew where I lived. They knew what I looked like. They'd followed me home maybe days later. Or maybe they were already there. And that's the part that keeps me up most nights. Not knowing what I was hiding from, just knowing it found me anyway. I don't usually tell people about this trip. There's nothing heroic about it, and nothing to be proud of. I didn't save anyone or do anything clever. I just survived. That's all I did. And that alone still wakes me up at night. This happened 3 years ago, early fall. The leaves had just started turning in northern Washington. That dry crunch under your boots sort of season. I'd been going on solo trips for a few years already, just a tent, food, and my own 2 legs. I loved it that way. The silence of the woods, the weight of your pack, the sound of nothing but the wind and your own breath. No people, no phones, just clean air and space to think. This time, I picked an area I hadn't explored yet. It was around Hollow Ridge, a long stretch of trail near the border of a remote state forest. Not the kind of place you stumble into. It's not on any tourist map. I'd only found it through an old online forum thread where someone mentioned it in passing. They said it wasn't maintained anymore, but there were still decent paths and spots to camp if you didn't mind going off-grid. That was exactly what I wanted. The morning I drove up, the last town I passed through was a quiet place with a single gas station and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 60s. I gassed up, checked the maps, made sure I had my satellite phone in case of an emergency, and then drove another 20 miles down rough gravel roads until the trees closed in so thick on either side that my truck's antenna started slapping branches. I parked where the road stopped, just a small dirt clearing with enough room to turn around. No other cars, no signs. Perfect. I locked up the truck, adjusted my pack, and stepped into the trail. The first day was exactly what I needed. Quiet. The trail hadn't been maintained in years, that much was clear. It was narrow in places, overgrown in others, and some sections were barely visible. But I kept moving. I had topographic maps, a compass, and GPS as backup. The terrain followed a slow uphill climb, weaving through dense woods of pine and fir, the ground coated with needles and fallen branches. Now and then, I'd spot an old trail marker nailed into a tree. Most were faded or broken, but they were there. I hiked about 10 miles that day, took my time, stopped for lunch by a shallow stream, and even saw a few deer moving through the brush in the afternoon. By late evening, I'd found a small clearing just off the trail and set up my tent. The ground was flat and dry, with a small rise on one side that helped break the wind. I made a fire ring, collected wood, cooked a simple dinner, and sat there under the darkening sky as the last light left the trees. I slept easy that night. The air was crisp, and the stars were sharp overhead. Nothing but the sounds of the forest, branches creaking, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. I wasn't worried. I'd done this dozens of times. The second day, I pushed deeper. By noon, I hadn't seen another person. Not even a sign that someone had come this way in a long time. No wrappers, no boot prints, no broken twigs where they shouldn't be. It was like the forest had grown back over everything. I stopped for water and filtered it from a stream that ran colder and clearer than anything I'd tasted in years. The map showed a ridge coming up, a narrow, rocky stretch before dropping into a deep valley on the far side. That's where I planned to camp next. Climbing up that ridge was where things first started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could explain clearly at the time, just small things. The trees looked twisted, bent slightly in ways that didn't match the slope. The air felt still, like the wind had stopped entirely. The sun was out, but the light seemed dull, like something had taken the edge off it. I figured I was just tired and hungry, so I pressed on. At the top of the ridge, I paused and looked out over the valley. It was quiet, too quiet. Even when you're deep in the forest, there's usually some kind of background noise, birds, bugs, distant rustling. But here it was nothing, just the sound of my breath and my own heartbeat. I scanned the valley below and saw what looked like an old trail winding down, barely visible between the trees. I decided to follow it. I didn't feel good about staying up there. Something about the ridge felt wrong. The path going down was steep and rough. I had to use my hands in a few places to scramble over rock and brush. But after about half a mile, the trail flattened out again, and I found myself in a much denser part of the forest. The trees grew closer together, tall and thick, blocking most of the sunlight. The undergrowth was heavier, and walking became slower, more careful. I kept moving, glancing down at my map often. It showed this area as part of the old hollow ridge path, but the markings were vague. Just dotted lines, as if even when the map was made, they weren't sure what was out here. Around 4 p.m., I came across something strange. It was a clearing, but not like the one I'd camped in the night before. This one looked like it had been made. The trees didn't thin naturally. They stopped suddenly in a rough square shape, like someone had cut them years ago. In the middle of the space was a small pile of rocks. Not natural ones either. They were stacked, deliberate, about waist-high, rounded at the top, like a marker. I didn't touch it. I didn't even get that close. I just stared at it for a long minute, then made a wide arc around it and kept going. I don't know what it was. A grave? A trail marker? A forgotten campsite? All I knew was that it hadn't been made by animals, and it wasn't recent. Moss had grown up over the lower stones, and dead leaves had built up around its base. It had been there a long time. By sundown, I found another spot to camp. This one didn't feel as safe. The ground was damp, the trees hung low, and the air carried a smell like wet bark and iron. But I didn't have many options. I was too far to turn back, and the sun was already dropping. So I cleared what I could, set up my tent, and lit a small fire using the driest wood I could find. It took longer than usual. Everything around here felt damp, heavy. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, unsure why. I'd turn, adjust my sleeping bag, close my eyes again, then wake again, and again. No sounds outside, no wind, just stillness. Around 2 a.m., I sat up and unzipped the tent a few inches, shining my flashlight out. The forest looked like it wasn't breathing. You know that feeling you get when you know you're being watched? Like your back is exposed. Even if you're alone, that's what it felt like. Except it wasn't coming from any direction. It was all around. Like the woods themselves had eyes. Like everything out there had gone silent, not to rest, but to listen. I closed the tent and stayed awake the rest of the night. By morning, I was done. I wanted out. I didn't care if the hike back took all day. I ate a quick breakfast, packed my gear as fast as I could, and started back the way I came. Except I couldn't find the trail. I retraced my steps as best I could. I knew where I'd entered the valley. I had GPS, compass, maps, everything. But the landmarks were wrong. The trees looked different. The terrain felt wrong. The GPS kept glitching, showing me bouncing between 2 points. The compass spun slightly, not wild, but slow and inconsistent. I told myself I wasn't lost. Couldn't be. I just needed to climb back toward the ridge, regain the high ground, and reorient. That climb took hours. I had to bushwhack most of it, pushing through undergrowth that clawed at my clothes and skin. I slipped once and cut my leg on a rock. Nothing deep, but it bled down into my boot. My pack started to feel heavier than it should have. I stopped every hour to drink water, catch my breath, and scan the area. Still no trail, no markers, no familiar signs. By the time I reached the top of the ridge again, the sun was low. I was sweating, dirty, bleeding slightly, and exhausted. But I could see the valley behind me and the faint shapes of the mountains further west. I was back on the right track. I was sure of it. Then I saw the rock pile again. The same one. Same size, same moss at the base. Same arrangement of stones. I climbed in a full circle. That moment broke something in me. I just stood there, staring at it, not even breathing. I checked my compass again, still spinning. I looked at the GPS blank screen. I hadn't turned it off. The battery wasn't dead. It was just blank. I didn't camp that night. I just sat there, propped against a tree, staring into the dark. I couldn't light a fire. I was too tired. The forest was too wet. I ate a protein bar with shaking hands and drank the last of my water. Then I waited. Around midnight, I heard movement. Not an animal, not some deer or raccoon. This was different. It was two-legged, heavy, measured. Something was walking out there. Not close, but not far. I froze. I couldn't see anything. I didn't move. It circled. Not fast, not slow, just circled. Then it stopped, and I never heard it again. When morning came, I stood up. I never thought a simple weekend away would turn into something I'd never forget. Something that made me question how safe I really am when I'm alone out in the woods. It was just supposed to be a quiet break from the city, a chance to disconnect, enjoy some fresh air, and sleep away from the noise. I found the cabin online, a small, rustic place tucked away in the middle of a dense forest, far from any town or main road. It was isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. The drive there took longer than expected. The last stretch was a gravel road that wound its way through the trees, shaking my car and making the small rocks ping against the undercarriage. The sun was already dipping low by the time I pulled into the small clearing where the cabin sat. It wasn't fancy, just a single-story wooden structure, weathered but solid. The porch sagged a little and the paint was peeling, but the place had character. I stepped out, took a deep breath of pine and damp earth, and felt the quiet settle around me. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and something faintly musty, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the single room was sparsely furnished. A small kitchen counter, a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, and a fold-out bed that looked like it might collapse if I moved the wrong way. There was a small bathroom with a shower, but no hot water, something I'd seen warned about in the listing. I had packed extra blankets and a small gas stove for heat just in case. I unpacked my bag slowly, methodically. A few canned goods, some water, a flashlight, batteries, and a couple of books. No signal on my phone once I got inside, just a no service icon blinking at me. That wasn't a surprise. I made sure to tell a friend where I was going before I left, but out here, the woods stretched so thick that I couldn't even see the sky properly from inside the cabin. After setting up, I sat by the window and watched the last light fade from the trees. The woods seemed peaceful at first, silent but for the occasional rustle of wind in the branches or a distant bird call. As darkness crept in, the shadows deepened, and the forest felt like it was holding its breath. I made myself some soup on the stove and ate slowly, savoring the silence. Outside, the stars came out, bright and cold, but I didn't stay outside long. The cold air crept into my bones, and the darkness felt heavy. I lit a couple of candles on the table and sat with a book, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. Around midnight, that's when things started to feel off. The silence was too deep, too complete. Usually, in the woods, you hear the calls of night animals. Owls, insects, the rustling of small creatures in the brush. But here, it was almost as if everything had stopped. No wind, no animals, no sound at all. Just the soft creak of the cabin settling. I felt a chill crawl over me that had nothing to do with the temperature. I tried to ignore it and closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. Every little noise made me tense. A twig snapping somewhere outside made my heart jump. I reminded myself it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. The forest was full of life, but tonight, it seemed silent, watchful. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, footsteps. Heavy, slow steps just outside the cabin. Not the quick, light padding of an animal, but deliberate, human-like steps. They circled the cabin, slow and steady. I froze, heart pounding, breath caught in my throat. My mind raced. Was someone out there? Had I made a mistake coming here alone? I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the window. The beam swept across the trees and the clearing, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard them again, this time closer to the back door. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, more for comfort than real defense, and moved slowly to the door, listening. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped altogether. Nothing. The silence returned, heavier than before. I stayed up for hours, flashlight in hand, watching every shadow, every movement. The morning light was a relief, but the uneasy feeling didn't fully leave me. During the day, I explored the nearby area carefully. The forest seemed normal again, birds chirping, squirrels darting about. I found a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods, but I didn't follow it. There was something about the way the trees stood, the way the light hit the ground, that felt oppressive. I wanted to get out, but I also didn't want to drive in the dark on those rough roads. That night was worse. The footsteps returned, but now they were joined by other sounds, soft voices I couldn't understand, the shuffle of feet in the leaves, the scrape of something metal against wood. I didn't dare look outside. I sat frozen by the window, knife in hand, listening as the noises circled the cabin, getting closer, then retreating. I realized then that this wasn't some random hiker or lost camper. Someone was deliberately stalking the cabin. It felt like a game to them, testing me, making sure I was awake, that I knew they were there. I tried to call for help, but my phone was useless. The nearest house was miles away, and I had no way to contact anyone. I didn't want to leave the cabin and run blindly into the woods, so I barricaded the door as best I could with a heavy chair and anything I could find. The night dragged on. Every creak, every rustle made me jump. The cold seeped in despite the blankets and the small stove. I felt trapped, small and vulnerable in that wooden box surrounded by trees. Then, just before dawn, the noises stopped. No footsteps, no voices, nothing but the wind moving through the pines. I waited until the sky lightened before I dared to open the door. Outside, the clearing looked untouched, except for something that made my blood run cold. Deep, wide footprints circling the cabin, coming close to the windows and doors. The prints were too large to be a person's, almost like work boots or hunting boots, and they were fresh, the ground still soft from recent rain. I looked around for any sign of where whoever was out there had gone, but the woods were quiet, empty. I packed my things as fast as I could. I didn't care about leaving any gear behind. I just wanted to get away. The drive back was nerve-wracking. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see headlights following me, but there was nothing. The road was empty, the trees lining it like silent watchers. I made it back to civilization just as the sun rose fully. I stopped at a gas station, called a friend, and told them everything. No lies, no exaggerations. The police didn't take me seriously at first, saying maybe it was some pranksters or hunters. But I knew better. Whoever had been out there was watching, waiting. It wasn't random. It was planned. A few weeks later, I read about a series of break-ins in cabins nearby. People had reported similar footsteps and noises at night, but no one had caught the perpetrators. It made sense now. I never went back. The forest, the cabin, the footsteps, they became a warning to me. Out there, in the woods, away from everything, you're not as alone as you think. People can watch you, follow you, and make you feel small and trapped without ever stepping inside. That cabin was the closest I've ever been to real fear. Not some ghost story or nightmare, but the cold, hard reality of being hunted. And that's why I'll never forget the cabin in the woods. The drive-in was longer than I expected. The narrow dirt road stretched out through thick pine forests on both sides, the trees so close they blocked most of the fading light. I hadn't seen another car for miles, and the only sound was the crunch of my tires over gravel and the occasional snap of a twig from something unseen moving in the underbrush. My old Jeep rattled as I pushed it further into the remote area I'd found on an online map, a little hidden corner where a small cabin was listed for rent. No cell signal, no Wi-Fi. Exactly what I wanted. The sun was slipping behind the hills as I pulled up the last stretch of trail, a rough slope leading up to a small clearing. The cabin sat there, made of dark wood, weathered by time and weather. It wasn't fancy, just a simple one-room structure with a tiny porch, a chimney, and a couple of windows, all covered in dirt and grime. The roof sagged a little on one side, but the place looked solid. It felt like it belonged there, as if it had been waiting for me all these years. I grabbed my backpack and stepped out. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and wet earth. It was quiet except for a faint breeze rustling the branches above. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground as I approached the cabin door. It creaked open easily when I pushed it, revealing a dim interior. The only light came from a few slivers through the grimy windows. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy in a rugged sort of way. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and empty but covered with a fine layer of soot. Against another wall was a worn wooden table with two creaky chairs. The floor was rough planks, scarred and scratched from years of use. A bed frame stood in the corner with a thin, moth-eaten mattress. There were some old cooking pots on a rusty stove and a battered metal sink with no running water. The place smelled of damp wood and something faintly like old smoke, but also something else. A slight hint of decay, like something dead had been left here a while ago and the smell had just never gone away. I dropped my pack and started to unpack my things. I had brought food that didn't need refrigeration, a good supply of water, a lantern with fresh fuel, matches, and a small axe. I'd also packed a couple of books, a notepad, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I wasn't planning on staying long, just a couple of nights to get away from the city noise and stress. As night fell, I built a fire in the fireplace. The crackling flames gave me a small sense of comfort. I boiled water for some instant soup and sat by the fire, feeling the warmth on my face. Outside, the darkness was thick and absolute, a blackness that swallowed everything beyond the small circle of light from the fire. The woods were alive with sounds, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of branches, and distant, low growls that I guessed were coyotes or maybe wolves. I wasn't too worried. I'd camped in the woods before and knew how to keep safe, but something about this place felt different. Hard to explain exactly, like I was being watched, even though I knew it was probably just my imagination. I tried to relax, read a few pages of one of my books, then crawled into the narrow bed. The thin mattress wasn't very comfortable, but after the long drive, I was exhausted. I turned off the lantern and lay there in the dark, listening to the forest. Hours later, I woke up suddenly. My heart was pounding. I had heard a noise, a soft but distinct sound like something scraping outside the cabin door. At first, I thought maybe it was just a branch or a rock rolling down the hill, but it happened again. Slow, deliberate scraping, as if someone or something was trying to move the door. I froze, straining my ears. The forest outside was completely silent now except for the faint scraping. My mind raced, imagining all sorts of things. The cabin door was old and weak. If someone wanted to get in, they probably could. I reached for the flashlight and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the door and the small porch outside. Nothing was there. No footprints, no shadows, no sign of any intruder. The scraping sound stopped. I sat up, feeling the sweat on my skin even though the cabin was cold. I checked my pack for the small knife I always carried. It was there. I considered going outside to look, but the thought of stepping out into the black woods at night was terrifying. Instead, I stayed awake, flashlight in hand, until the first light of dawn. When morning came, I forced myself to get up and check outside. The porch was covered in pine needles and dry leaves, but there was nothing unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, just the quiet forest. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer scratching at the door, looking for food. That made sense. But the feeling that something wasn't right lingered. I spent the next day exploring the area around the cabin. The forest stretched in every direction, dense and untouched. I found a small creek nearby with clear cold water and picked some wild berries, careful to avoid any that looked suspicious. The silence was thick, but I started to feel a little more at ease. That night, I took extra precautions. I built a bigger fire, placed some makeshift traps around the cabin, just sticks arranged to make noise if stepped on, and kept the axe close at hand. The night passed uneventfully, or so I thought. On the third night, things got worse. It started with a faint tapping on the window. I was reading by the fire when I heard it. A slow, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on glass. I froze and slowly moved to the window. The glass was grimy, but I could just make out dark shapes moving outside. I shone the flashlight outside. Nothing. But the tapping continued, now on a different window, then another. It wasn't loud, but steady enough to make me nervous. I checked all the locks and bolted the door as best I could. But the tapping didn't stop. I went outside with the axe and walked around the cabin, searching for any signs of someone or something. The forest was still and quiet. No footprints in the dirt or snow, nothing. I stayed out there for nearly an hour, shining my flashlight into the woods, calling out quietly to see if anyone was around. No reply. Back inside, I tried to keep calm. I moved the furniture to block the windows and door, covered the windows with blankets. I was sure now that someone was out there, maybe watching me. The thought made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found something chilling. There, etched into the dirt on the porch, was a single footprint, much too big to be mine. It was fresh, the edges still sharp, as if someone had been there just hours before. No other footprints surrounded it, just this one, as if whoever made it had come and gone without a trace. I felt trapped. The forest was too dense and vast to run through. My Jeep was the only way out, but I wasn't sure if it would start after sitting so long on the rough trail. I checked my phone, still no signal. I spent the day preparing to leave. I packed up my things, doused the fire, and made sure everything was ready. That night, I barely slept again. Every noise, every shadow seemed threatening. Then, around 3 a.m., the worst happened. I woke up to a loud crash. The cabin door had been forced open. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing. My axe was just a few feet away, and I grabbed it without hesitation. The door was hanging off its hinges. Splintered wood scattered across the floor. Outside, the night was pitch black. I could hear heavy footsteps moving away into the woods. The sound was uneven, like whoever it was limping or carrying something heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and jacket and ran outside. The cold night air hit me hard. I scanned the trees, shining the light into the darkness. There was a trail of broken branches and disturbed leaves leading away from the cabin. I ran after it, but the trail quickly disappeared into dense underbrush. The forest was too thick, and I didn't want to get lost. I realized I was alone, out here miles from help, with someone who had broken into the cabin. The adrenaline pushed me to get back inside, lock whatever was left of the door, and grab my phone once more. Still no signal. I knew I had to get out at first light. When dawn broke, I carefully stepped outside to check the Jeep. To my relief, the engine started right up, but the gas was low. I quickly loaded my gear, locking the cabin as best I could behind me. The drive back felt endless. The sun was up now, but the forest still seemed to watch me. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, expecting to see something following. It took nearly 2 hours to get back to the main road. When I finally pulled onto the paved highway, my hands shook with relief. I stopped at the first gas station I could find and called the local police. I reported the break-in and the strange noises, but there wasn't much they could do without more evidence. They said the area had seen some petty crime before, poachers, trespassers, people looking for places to hide out, but nothing violent. I never went back. Later, I learned that the cabin had been abandoned for years before I rented it. The previous owner disappeared without explanation, and some locals believed the forest near it attracted all sorts of unwanted visitors. Drifters, criminals, and worse. I realized I had been planning this trip for months. A week alone, deep in the woods, far from anything and anyone. My goal was simple: disconnect from everything and just be by myself. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the trees. I'd booked a small cabin on the edge of a national forest, a place so remote it wasn't on many maps, the kind of place people talked about but rarely visited. The idea of being alone in the wilderness excited me. I needed a break from the city, from work, from people. When I arrived, it was late afternoon. The dirt road that led to the cabin was narrow, rutted, and lined with tall pine trees that stretched high into a gray sky. The air smelled fresh and cold, with the faint scent of moss and damp earth. The cabin itself was simple. One story, wooden, with a small porch and windows clouded with dust. It looked older, maybe built in the 50s or 60s, but well cared for. The previous renters had left it neat, except for some fallen leaves swept into corners. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me first, musty wood mixed with the faint aroma of smoke from the old stone fireplace. The cabin was sparsely furnished. A small table with 2 chairs, a simple couch, a kitchen area with a gas stove, and a bed tucked into a corner. There was a stack of firewood by the fireplace, and some old books and magazines on the shelves. I dropped my backpack by the door and took a deep breath. For a moment, the silence was complete, broken only by the soft creaks of the wooden floorboards settling. The wind outside rustled the branches, and I could hear the distant call of a bird or two. No cars, no voices, nothing but nature. Exactly what I wanted. I unpacked my things slowly, organizing food, water, and gear. I made a list in my head of what I needed to do before night fell. Gather firewood, check the supplies, explore the nearby area a little, and then settle in for the evening. The sun was already dipping behind the trees by the time I stepped outside again with an axe and a small saw I'd brought. The woods felt dense and quiet. I walked a short distance from the cabin, looking for fallen branches and dry wood. The ground was soft beneath my boots, covered in pine needles and scattered leaves. Occasionally, I spotted animal tracks, deer or maybe raccoons. I paused and listened, but the forest only gave back the sound of the wind brushing through the needles and the distant cawing of a crow. I gathered a decent pile of wood, enough to last a few nights, then returned to the cabin. Inside, I stacked the wood neatly by the fireplace, pulled out the matches and started a fire. The flames crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The warmth felt good after the chilly air outside. I settled on the couch with a cup of instant coffee and watched the fire dance. The quiet was soothing at first, but as darkness crept in, the silence grew heavy. Outside, the forest turned pitch black, and the cabin's little windows framed only blackness. I checked my watch, it was just past 8 p.m. I figured I'd read for a bit, then get to bed early. But then I noticed something odd. From the corner of my eye, I saw a movement outside one of the windows. A quick flicker, like a shadow slipping between the trees. I froze and stared. Nothing, just darkness. Maybe a deer, I thought. Animals were normal here. Still, the feeling stayed with me, a strange tightness in my chest. I told myself to shake it off. No one else was around. No one could be here. I sat back, tried to focus on my book, but the sound of the fire crackling and the silence outside felt unnatural now. Then I heard it, soft, very soft, footsteps crunching on dry leaves outside. Slow, deliberate steps. I froze again. The cabin was old but solid, and the windows were shut tight, so no noise should come in that clearly. Still, I could hear it. Footsteps. My heart started to race. I got up and moved closer to the window, peering into the darkness. The firelight flickered on the glass, making it hard to see clearly. I strained my eyes. Then I saw it. Another flash of movement just beyond the edge of the clearing where the cabin sat. I held my breath and scanned the shadows. The forest was black and still again. I waited, but nothing more came. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe someone else camping nearby. But the fact no one had told me about anyone else around made me uneasy. I checked my phone, no signal. Of course, I was deep in the forest with 0 bars. No way to call for help. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. I checked my flashlight and made sure the door was locked tight. The night dragged on. I tried to distract myself, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. This time closer, louder, crunching on twigs and leaves right outside the cabin. I could hear them circling, slow and careful, as if someone was trying not to be noticed but was still right there, moving along the tree line. I felt trapped. The cabin was my only shelter, and the woods stretched dark and endless beyond the windows. I remembered the axe I had brought and kept it by the door, gripping it tightly. I thought about lighting the porch light to scare whoever it was off, but the bulb was burnt out. No electricity here, only the gas lamp on the table. I debated whether to open the door or stay quiet. I decided staying quiet was safer. The footsteps continued for maybe half an hour, circling and stopping, then moving again. At one point, I saw a faint flashlight beam sweep through the trees, flashing near the cabin but never directly at it. I wondered if it was a hunter or someone lost. Then, abruptly, the footsteps stopped. I waited another hour, too tense to sleep, until I finally heard the distant howl of a coyote. It was a hollow, eerie sound that echoed through the trees, making me jump. When the morning light finally crept through the window, I was exhausted, tense, and shaky. I packed up quickly, eager to leave. But before I left, I decided to check outside around the cabin in daylight. I found footprints, human footprints, heavy boots, fresh. They circled the cabin several times, but there were no signs of camping gear or a fire nearby.
No trash, no tents.
Just footprints. I realized then that someone had been watching me all night. Someone had moved quietly around the cabin, waiting, maybe hoping I'd open the door or slip out. I thought about calling the park rangers, but there was no cell service and I was hours from the nearest road. I packed everything into my car and left as fast as I could. When I reached a town and got signal, I called the authorities to report what happened. They told me there had been reports of trespassers and poachers in the area recently. People who didn't want to be found, living off the grid in the forest. They said sometimes these people would stalk cabins, watching for visitors to rob or scare away. I realized how lucky I was. That night in the cabin was the closest I ever want to come to true fear. No ghosts, no spirits, no fairy tale monsters. Just a real human threat, someone hiding in the woods, waiting for their chance. The cabin was supposed to be a peaceful retreat. Instead, it became a place where I learned how terrifying it is to be truly alone and vulnerable in the wilderness. Since then, I never go anywhere without letting someone know exactly where I am. And I never stay in a place I can't lock down tight and call for help easily. Started out like any other trip. I was looking forward to a few days alone, away from the noise of the city, just me and the woods. I had rented a small cabin in a remote part of northern Maine, a place with no cell service, no neighbors for miles, and the kind of quiet that makes you think twice about every little sound. The kind of place where you feel completely isolated. But that's exactly why I wanted to be there. I arrived just before sunset on a Friday, driving a narrow, dirt road that seemed to stretch forever through dense forest. The trees on either side were thick and tall, mostly pine and spruce, standing straight like sentinels. The air smelled sharp and fresh, the kind of cold you feel deep in your lungs. When I pulled up to the cabin, the sun was just a sliver dipping behind the hills, and shadows were growing long. The cabin itself was small, old but solid. Weathered gray wood, a stone chimney, and a small porch with a rickety wooden bench. It looked like it hadn't changed much in 50 years. Inside, the smell of pine and old wood filled the air. It was simple: a main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen area, and a loft with a bed. No electricity, no running water. Just what I wanted, a break from everything. I unpacked my gear: a few cans of beans, some bread, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and my camping stove. I had a stack of firewood outside, and I immediately set to work building a fire inside the stove. The dry wood crackled and spit as the flames caught, warming the small cabin quickly. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. Without city noise or even the occasional distant car, the silence felt thick. I listened to the wind pushing through the trees outside, the faint rustle of animals moving in the underbrush. I had a book with me, but I found myself staring at the fire more than reading. My thoughts kept drifting, unsettled by the stillness. I tried to sleep but kept waking up at odd times, hearing noises that didn't make sense. Sometimes it was a snap of a twig or the scurrying of small creatures outside. Nothing I could identify clearly, but enough to keep my senses sharp. Eventually, I drifted off. The next day, I woke up early to the sound of birds. I stepped outside, breathing in the cold morning air, and took a slow walk around the cabin. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, but the trees felt different. Closer, watching. It's hard to explain, but something about the way the shadows moved under the trees gave me a strange feeling, like being watched but not by animals. I tried to shrug it off as my imagination. I spent the day chopping more firewood, fetching water from a nearby stream, and exploring the area. The cabin was about a mile from the closest dirt road, which meant no unexpected visitors. That evening, I cooked some beans over the stove and sat back to relax. As darkness fell, the forest came alive in a different way. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and making the cabin creak. I kept the fire burning strong and double-checked my flashlight batteries. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was alert. Alone in the woods, you learn to pay attention to every sound and movement. Around midnight, something happened that changed everything. I was just about to go to sleep when I heard a knock on the cabin door. A knock, hard, slow, 3 times. At first, I thought I must be dreaming. No one else was supposed to be out here. I stared at the door, heart pounding, trying to figure out what to do. The knock came again, louder this time, urgent almost. I didn't open the door. I wasn't sure if it was someone playing a prank, or someone in trouble, or something worse. My mind raced through every possibility. The logical part of me wanted to just ignore it. The other part felt a creeping fear that I couldn't shake. I grabbed the flashlight and peered through the small window beside the door. Nothing, just the dark forest. No sign of anyone standing there. I waited, holding my breath, but the knocking stopped. The silence returned. I didn't sleep much after that, constantly listening for sounds. The next morning, I found something strange outside. Near the porch, on the ground, were 3 deep scratches carved into the wood of the cabin's frame. They looked fresh, raw, like someone or something had clawed at the wood with force. I didn't know what to think. There were no animal tracks nearby big enough to make marks like that, at least none that I could see. It didn't make sense. I spent the day on edge. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the woods, feeling eyes on me, but there was no one. That night, I stayed up late by the fire, watching the darkness through the window. Around 2 a.m., I saw a faint light moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was a flashlight, maybe someone lost, but the light flickered oddly, as if it was being waved or moving quickly. I grabbed my own flashlight and stepped outside, heart hammering. The cold air bit at my skin, and the forest was silent except for the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. I shined the light toward the movement, but the light vanished, leaving only dark shadows. I walked a bit deeper into the woods, but found nothing. No footprints, no signs of anyone. Only the natural forest and the cold night. I returned to the cabin and locked the door. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every sound. The knocking never came again, but the fear stayed with me. The next morning, I was ready to leave. I packed quickly, but as I loaded my car, I noticed something else. In the dirt near the cabin, I saw footprints. Not mine. They were large, heavy, and seemed to circle the cabin several times. They looked human, but oddly shaped, too big and uneven. I followed them a bit into the woods, but they disappeared. No trail, no sign of anyone else. I drove off as fast as I could, the woods shrinking behind me. Back in town, I told the rental agency about what happened. They seemed surprised and said no one else had reported anything strange. The cabin had been empty for months. I never went back. I told myself it was probably someone messing around, maybe hunters or campers trying to scare people. But the scratches on the wood, the knocking, the footprints, they didn't add up. To this day, I don't know what was out there in those woods, but I do know one thing. I will never stay in that cabin again. I had been looking forward to the trip for weeks. The idea was simple. Get away from the city, the noise, and the people. A small cabin, deep in the woods, far enough that cell phones didn't work and there was no internet. Just me, the forest, and a few days to disconnect and recharge. I had found the cabin through an online rental site, a remote place tucked in a mountainous area, with good reviews that mentioned peace and quiet. I packed what I thought I'd need: a good sleeping bag, some canned food, water, a gas stove, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit.
No fancy electronics, no distractions.
The drive was long but easy enough. The roads grew narrower and rougher as I left the last town behind, and eventually I was on a dirt track, surrounded by tall pines that blocked out most of the sky. The air smelled fresh, damp from recent rain, and cool against my skin. When I reached the cabin, it was exactly as described. A small wooden shack built into a slight clearing. The walls were rough-hewn logs, darkened by age and weather, the roof covered in moss and fallen leaves. The windows were dirty but intact, and the door creaked when I opened it. Inside was sparsely furnished: a sturdy table, 2 chairs, a small wood stove in the corner, and a narrow bed frame with a thin mattress. The floorboards were uneven, and there was a faint smell of mildew mixed with wood smoke. I dropped my bags, feeling a small thrill at being alone in a place so far removed from the usual world. I started by lighting a small fire in the stove to chase away the damp chill. Outside, the forest stretched dark and quiet, the fading daylight filtering weakly through the thick canopy. No sounds of cars, planes, or distant towns, just the occasional bird call or rustling of leaves in the breeze. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans and bread, while watching the fire crackle and burn. Afterward, I cleaned up, laid out my sleeping bag, and settled in for the night. I expected to feel relaxed, calm, but there was a strange tension in the air that I couldn't shake. The first night was mostly uneventful. I woke once or twice, hearing sounds outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but it felt normal, part of the forest's nightlife. I reassured myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or raccoon wandering nearby. The cold crept in through the cracks in the walls, but the fire stove helped. Morning light seeped through the grimy windows, and I felt a little better. Over the next day, I explored the nearby woods. The trees were dense, mostly pines and oaks, with a thick carpet of needles and fallen leaves underfoot. The terrain was uneven, with small hills and rocky outcrops. I noticed some old tracks near a stream, maybe deer or bear, but nothing fresh or threatening. The isolation was exactly what I wanted. No one around for miles, no sounds but nature. That night, though, things began to change. I had just finished dinner when I heard a faint noise outside the cabin. Something like the scraping of wood on wood. I froze and listened. It stopped after a few seconds. I convinced myself it was the wind or a branch brushing against the cabin's walls. Still, I checked all the windows and the door, making sure everything was locked tight. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness outside, but there was nothing unusual. I crawled into my sleeping bag, still uneasy. Around midnight, I woke to a loud thump on the cabin wall. It sounded solid, like something hitting the wood with force. My heart raced, and I sat up quickly, eyes wide in the dark. The fire in the stove had died down, leaving the room cold and silent except for the occasional creak of the old cabin settling. I reached for the flashlight and shone it out the window. The beam fell on the trees, shadows twisting and shifting, but no movement. I strained my ears, but all I could hear was the wind picking up and the occasional drip of water from leaves. The silence pressed in on me, thick and heavy. I tried to calm my breathing and remind myself this was just an old cabin in the woods. Animals were curious and sometimes clumsy. Still, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I dozed off, a new noise startled me awake. A snap of a twig, a faint scraping near the door, the sound of something shifting outside the window. The feeling that I was being watched was overwhelming. I didn't want to imagine what might be out there, but my mind raced through all the possibilities: wild animals, other people, something worse. By morning, I was exhausted and jumpy. I stayed inside most of the day, checking the perimeter of the cabin for any signs of recent visitors. The ground around the cabin was littered with fallen leaves and pine needles, but I noticed some faint tracks pressed into the soft earth. Large, boot-shaped prints that didn't belong to any animal. The footprints were spaced apart like someone had walked slowly around the cabin. My stomach tightened. I took a few photos of the prints and packed up a small emergency bag, just in case I needed to leave quickly. I also set up a makeshift alarm system with some old cans tied to string around the perimeter. If anyone came close, the cans would rattle and wake me. I felt a little safer knowing I had some warning. The next night was worse. Around 10 p.m., I heard footsteps crunching in the leaves outside. They moved slowly but purposefully, circling the cabin. The cans began to clatter softly, then louder as the footsteps drew near. I held the flashlight tightly and stared at the windows, waiting for something to appear. The sound stopped suddenly, and for several minutes everything was silent. Then I heard a low, slow scratching on the door, like someone trying to get in without breaking it down. My hands trembled as I reached for the small hunting knife I'd brought along. The noise stopped after a minute, but my heart was pounding. I knew whoever or whatever was out there had found me, or at least the cabin. I stayed awake until dawn, sitting beside the stove and trying to keep my nerves steady. I thought about calling for help, but there was no signal here. I wasn't sure if I was dealing with a person or an animal, but either way, I was in danger. The woods, which had felt peaceful before, now seemed like a trap. Morning came slowly, bringing light and warmth. I packed up as fast as I could, gathering all my things and checking the doors and windows one last time. The boot prints were still there, closer to the cabin now. Whoever had been out there was no longer circling, but had been right next to the door. I didn't stop to think about what might have happened if I'd stayed another night. I got in my car and started the long drive back, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror at the cabin growing smaller behind me. I didn't speak or look at anything else on the way. I just focused on getting home, on reaching safety. Later, when I showed the photos of the footprints to a local ranger, they told me that area had been known for occasional illegal hunters or trespassers who didn't like being found. They said it was rare, but not unheard of. No ghosts, no monsters, just people who didn't want company. That knowledge didn't make me feel better. It explained the fear, but it didn't erase the memory of those long hours alone, trapped in that tiny cabin, hearing footsteps and scratching in the dark. I never went back. The cabin stayed empty after that, and I always wondered what might have happened if I hadn't left when I did. Maybe nothing, or maybe something worse. The forest is beautiful but also unforgiving, and sometimes the scariest things are not the ones you imagine, but the ones you never see. The plan was simple. Spend a few days alone in a remote cabin in the mountains. Get away from everything. No phone, no internet, no distractions. Just me, nature, and the silence. I wanted to clear my head after a long stretch of work and city noise. The constant hum of people, cars, and the endless bright lights. The cabin I found was off the grid, miles from the nearest town or road. The owner said it was isolated but safe. I didn't care about safe. I wanted quiet. I wanted to feel small in the vastness of the woods. I wanted to breathe again. The drive-in was rough, gravel roads that twisted and climbed for miles. Trees leaned in over the road, thick and dark. I kept my eyes on the path, trying not to imagine what might be watching behind the trunks. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and as I got higher, the temperature dropped noticeably. When I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The cabin was old but sturdy, a rough wooden box with a small porch and a wood stove pipe poking from the roof. It looked like it belonged to another era, like it had grown out of the forest itself. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. A pile of firewood sat stacked neatly by the side, and the windows were grimy but intact. The owner left a bucket of water by the door and a lantern with some fuel inside. No instructions beyond a key taped under the door frame. I pulled my pack off the passenger seat and grabbed my bag of supplies. Enough food to last, a first aid kit, a good knife, my flashlight, some maps, and a camping stove in case I needed it. I locked the car behind me, one less worry. The forest was silent except for the occasional creak of branches and the distant call of a bird. The sky was thick with clouds, low and gray, promising rain later. Inside, the cabin smelled like damp wood and old smoke. Dust motes floated in the shafts of weak light through the windows. A small kitchen area was off to one side, with a battered sink and an old cast-iron stove. The main room had a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bed shoved into the corner. A bookshelf held a few weathered books and some old tools. I dropped my gear on the floor and lit the lantern, the warm yellow glow pushing back the shadows. After unpacking, I started a fire in the wood stove. The first few logs smoked heavily, sending acrid fumes into the room. I opened a window for ventilation. The fire slowly caught, warming the small cabin. I sat down on the edge of the bed and looked out the window. The trees surrounded me on all sides, tall and silent. The sky was turning darker. It wasn't quite night yet, but the fading light made everything look heavier, thicker. I didn't want to admit it, but something about the place set my nerves on edge. Not fear exactly, more like a warning, like the forest was watching, waiting. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just tired from the drive, or maybe my mind was playing tricks in the dim light. After a while, I pulled out my food and ate a simple meal. Canned beans warmed on the stove, some bread, a few nuts. Nothing fancy, but it was enough. I washed the dishes in the bucket outside, feeling the cold water on my hands as the sun slipped behind the trees. Night came fast. The clouds thickened and pressed close. The cabin felt smaller, tighter, as darkness swallowed the woods. I lit the lantern again and sat by the fire, the flames crackling and dancing shadows across the walls. I tried to read one of the old books on the shelf, a history of the local area, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows. The forest looked like a black wall beyond the glass. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. At first, I thought it was the wind. The trees rattled, branches scraping against each other. Then a low, thudding sound. A footstep? No, it was too heavy and slow. It came from the side of the cabin, where the firewood was stacked. I held my breath, listening. The night was still except for that heavy step, slow and deliberate, moving around the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on. If whoever it was wanted to get close, I didn't want to give them the chance to see me first. The steps stopped, then a soft scrape, like someone dragging something along the ground. My heart pounded. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound wasn't right. It was too heavy, too careful. I pulled the door quietly shut and locked it. The cabin felt suddenly fragile, like it could be broken open at any moment. I sat back down near the fire, gripping my knife just in case. The thudding stopped, but my pulse raced. Every crack of wood or snap of a twig outside sent me flinching. I stayed awake the rest of the night, eyes fixed on the windows, waiting for whatever was out there. The lantern burned low, the fire sputtered, and the cold crept back into the corners of the cabin. I didn't sleep. Morning came with gray light filtering through the clouds. The woods were quiet again, as if nothing had happened. I dared to open the door. The firewood stack was disturbed. Some logs were shifted, and the ground beneath was scuffed with heavy prints. Not quite human, but close enough. The prints led into the trees, disappearing among the roots and leaves. I packed up quickly, grabbing my bag and putting out the fire. The feeling of being watched stayed with me as I walked down the path to the car. The woods were too quiet, the air too still. I drove away without looking back. The cabin, the forest, the heavy footsteps, they stayed behind, swallowed by the mist and shadows. But the unease followed me for days, a reminder that some places are not meant for solitude, not without company or protection. I didn't plan on anything dramatic that weekend, just a simple camping trip, something to get away from the city noise, from work emails, from the constant buzz of screens. I packed my bag carefully, tent, sleeping bag, stove, enough food for 2 days, water filter, basic first aid kit, a decent flashlight with extra batteries, and a small folding knife. Nothing fancy. I was headed to a state park I had visited once before, a few hours north of where I live. It was late spring, the days were warming up, but the nights could still get chilly. I arrived early afternoon on a Friday and chose a quiet spot near a small lake. The place was mostly empty, which was exactly what I wanted. I found a flat patch of ground under some tall pine trees, far enough from the water to avoid the bugs, but close enough to hear the gentle lapping of the waves. Setting up the tent took about 30 minutes. I made sure to secure all the stakes tightly and laid out my sleeping bag inside. The smell of fresh pine filled the air, mixed with damp earth from an earlier rain. I built a small fire ring with stones I found nearby and collected dry twigs and branches to start a fire later. The sun was dipping behind the trees as I gathered some more firewood. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional chirp of birds and the rustle of small animals moving in the underbrush. I was used to the outdoors, so none of it felt unusual. The air was cool but pleasant. After setting up the fire, I started cooking a simple meal. Canned chili heated in a small pot over the flames. The fire crackled and popped, throwing flickering light onto the surrounding trees. I ate slowly, enjoying the solitude. Once done, I cleaned my cookware carefully, making sure not to leave any food scraps behind that might attract animals. I sat back on a log, staring into the fire as stars began to prick the darkening sky. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, calm and still. It was peaceful. I checked my phone. It had no signal here, but the battery was full. I told myself I wouldn't use it much. Just nature, no distractions. As night fully settled in, I crawled into my tent, zipped the door closed, and turned on my flashlight briefly to check my gear. I left it off and settled into my sleeping bag. The temperature dropped quickly, and I pulled the bag tighter around me. The night was silent except for a few distant sounds. The occasional hoot of an owl, the faint splash of a fish jumping in the lake. That's when I first heard the noise. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer moving through the brush. But it was louder, more deliberate. A slow, crunching sound coming from somewhere beyond my tent, in the direction of the trees at the edge of the clearing. I sat up and listened. The sound stopped. Then, after a few seconds, it started again, closer this time. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. My heart began to beat faster. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it toward the noise. Nothing, just shadows and tree trunks. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or some other wild animal just passing through. I reminded myself that these woods were full of creatures at night. But then the noise came again, this time definitely closer, almost at the edge of my firelight if I had one. But my fire had died down hours ago. The clearing was dark except for the weak moonlight filtering through the trees. I could feel my pulse racing. I wanted to stay calm, but my body betrayed me. I grabbed the small folding knife from my pocket just in case. The noise stopped again. I held my breath. Then, just beyond the tent, I heard a soft rustling sound, like someone moving through dead leaves. My mind was racing. Who or what was out there? I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but the slow, careful steps felt deliberate, too steady to be random wildlife. I reached for my phone. Still no signal. I switched on the flashlight again, pointing it toward the source. I swept the beam slowly through the trees. Nothing. No movement. No eyes reflecting back. Still, the sound of crunching leaves started again, this time just on the other side of the clearing, near the far edge of the trees. I wasn't sure what to do. I thought about yelling for help but realized I was alone, miles from any other campers. And who would hear me? I tried to stay quiet, hoping whoever or whatever it was would go away. Minutes passed like hours. Then the noise stopped. I convinced myself that whatever it was had left. I lay back down, but sleep was impossible. Hours later, I woke up suddenly, feeling cold and alert. Outside, I heard the crunching again. This time, it was closer, almost right next to the tent. I froze. My flashlight was just out of reach on the small camping table. I tried to reach for it quietly, but accidentally knocked my water bottle over. It hit the ground with a loud clunk. The noise stopped immediately, then silence. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Minutes passed. I grabbed the flashlight and turned it on, sweeping the beam all around. Just trees, just shadows. Then, I noticed something that froze me in place. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible under the moonlight, there was a figure standing completely still. I couldn't tell much in the dark. It looked like a man, wearing dark clothes, a hood or cap pulled low over his face. He was staring right at my tent. I shined the light toward him, and he took a slow step back into the trees, disappearing. I didn't move. My heart was pounding in my ears. I debated what to do. I wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but the thought of stumbling around in the dark scared me too. I grabbed my knife and slowly unzipped the tent door, peeking outside. No one. I decided I had to move. I quickly packed my tent, trying not to make noise, throwing everything into my bag. My hands shook so much I nearly dropped my flashlight twice. Once everything was packed, I started walking toward the car. The path back to the parking lot was about a mile, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. As I walked, I kept turning my head, scanning the trees for any sign of the man. I heard branches snapping behind me once, and my heart jumped. But when I turned around, nothing was there. The woods felt alive with sounds now. Twigs breaking, leaves rustling, the wind picking up. I kept moving as fast as I could without running. Finally, after what felt like forever, I saw the parking lot lights flickering through the trees. I ran the last 100 feet, heart pounding. When I reached the car, I locked the doors behind me and started the engine immediately. I sat there for a few minutes, breathing hard, trying to calm down. I told myself maybe the man was just another camper or a park worker, maybe even a hunter. Maybe he was lost and looking for help. But the way he had stood there, watching me in silence, made it clear he wasn't there for friendly reasons. On the drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But the road was empty. The next day, I reported what I saw to the park rangers. They said there had been reports of some suspicious people lurking around recently. They warned me to be extra careful if I ever camped there again. I haven't gone back since. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear the crunching sound in my head, the slow footsteps in the dark, and I wonder what that man was really doing in the woods that night. The quiet peace I had expected was shattered by something real and frightening. Not a ghost story, not a legend, but something very human. I learned that nature can be peaceful, but it can also hide dangers you don't expect. Being prepared isn't just about the weather or the animals. It's about the people you might meet when you're all alone. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't the wilderness. It's what's waiting quietly just beyond the light. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It wasn't my first time camping alone, but this was the first time I chose a place so far from any established trail or campground. I wanted a quiet escape, a place where no one else was likely to come. I packed carefully, double-checked my gear, and drove hours to reach a small dirt road that disappeared into a dense forest. The sun was dipping low when I finally pulled over and grabbed my pack. The air smelled like pine and earth, thick and cool. I set off on foot, following a faint animal trail that wound into the trees. The woods here were old, untouched, full of towering firs and thick underbrush. The ground was soft with layers of pine needles, and the sound of my boots was muffled. I had my map and compass, and my phone had no signal, just like I wanted. It was a chance to be alone with nature, with nothing to rely on but my own skills and senses. The first few hours went smoothly. I found a small stream to refill my water bottle, rested under a large oak, and finally settled on a flat clearing surrounded by thick brush and tall trees. It was the kind of spot that felt private, hidden, perfect for setting up camp. I unpacked my gear, laid out my tent, and gathered firewood. The air was already getting cold as the sun slipped behind the mountains, but the warmth of the fire soon chased away the chill. I ate some simple food, jerky, nuts, and dried fruit, and watched the flames flicker and dance. The woods were alive with sounds. Crickets chirped, The stream babbled nearby, and a soft wind rustled the branches. I felt calm, peaceful even, knowing I was miles from any other person. As night fell fully, I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped the tent closed, and turned off my headlamp. The darkness was absolute. No streetlights, no moon, just black. The sounds of the forest changed. Owls hooted, and something large moved quietly in the distance. I listened for a long time, feeling both small and oddly safe. But then, sometime after midnight, I noticed a noise. It was faint at first, a soft crunching, like someone stepping carefully through dry leaves. My heart rate picked up. I stayed perfectly still, straining to hear. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Someone or something was moving through the woods. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent just a crack, careful not to let the light spill out. The beam cut through the dark, scanning the trees and underbrush. Nothing moved. I listened again, but the noise had stopped. Maybe it was an animal, a deer or a raccoon. Still, the hairs on my neck stood up. I closed the tent, zipped it tight, and tried to settle back into my sleeping bag, but sleep didn't come easy. Every crack and rustle outside made me tense. Hours passed like that, alert but silent, waiting. Then, just before dawn, I heard it again. Crunching footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling around my camp. I had left my knife next to me for emergencies. I gripped it tightly, ready to defend myself if I had to. I didn't want to imagine a person, someone dangerous, but the thought crept in anyway. The steps stopped suddenly, and the forest was quiet again. At first light, I slipped out of the tent to see if I could find any sign of whoever or whatever had been there. The ground was soft from last night's dew, and I spotted footprints in the dirt. Large, heavy, human. They were recent. The prints circled the camp twice before disappearing into the trees. I felt a chill. This wasn't just an animal. Someone had been here watching me, maybe a hunter or someone else camping nearby. But the way they moved, so quietly, so carefully, made me uneasy. I packed up my gear quickly and decided to hike out before they returned. I followed my trail back, eyes scanning constantly. The forest looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Twice I caught movement just beyond the tree line, a flash of something dark, but when I looked directly, it was gone. My heart pounded harder with each step. About an hour in, I came across a makeshift campfire and a small clearing. The fire was cold, but fresh. Nearby, there was a crudely built shelter made from branches and leaves. No one was there, but it was clear someone had been living rough in these woods. I checked around carefully but found no signs of a person. I decided to move quickly past that area. The daylight was fading fast, and I wanted to get back to my car before dark. As I moved, the trail became less distinct. The forest thickened, and I found myself brushing against low-hanging branches and thorny bushes. The quiet was overwhelming. No birds, no animals, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. Then I saw something on the ground ahead, a large rock, but with something tied to it. I stopped and looked closer. It was a bundle of what looked like pieces of cloth and string, tangled with some animal bones. My stomach twisted. It was a warning or some kind of mark left by whoever had been living here. I didn't want to stay to figure it out. I picked up my pace. My mind raced. Maybe I'd stumbled into a squatter's territory, someone who didn't want visitors. Maybe worse. My imagination filled with every possible bad outcome. I moved faster now, pushing through the underbrush and stepping over fallen logs. The light was almost gone, and I started to realize I had lost the trail. Panic rose inside me as I tried to find any familiar marker. The trees all looked the same. I stopped, took a deep breath, and tried to calm down. Using my compass, I headed roughly in the direction of the road. I knew I had to keep moving or risk being lost overnight. The forest closed in around me, shadows stretching long and dark. I heard footsteps again, this time closer, faster. My heart hammered. I stopped dead and listened. The steps slowed, then stopped. I held my breath, barely daring to blink. After a long moment, the forest was still again. I ran. Branches lashed at my face and arms as I pushed forward blindly, desperate to get out. My lungs burned and my legs screamed, but I didn't stop. After what felt like forever, I saw a faint glow ahead, the headlights of a car on the dirt road. I stumbled onto the road, gasping and trembling, and ran to my car. I locked the doors and started the engine without hesitation. The forest lay behind me, silent and dark. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the empty woods. The whole experience left me shaken. I realized how vulnerable I'd been. Alone in the wild, far from help, with someone else in those woods whose intentions I couldn't guess. It was a harsh reminder that nature is not just peaceful beauty. It's unpredictable, and sometimes people can be a threat just as much as the wilderness itself. I never went back to that spot, and since then, I've stuck to well-traveled trails and official campsites, where at least I know I'm not alone. Because out there, in those silent woods, I learned that fear is real, and sometimes, it's the only thing keeping you alive. I had planned this camping trip for months. I needed to get away from everything. The noise of the city, the endless buzz of people, and the feeling that I was just drifting through my life without any real connection to the world around me. I decided to go to a forest reserve a few hours outside of town, a place I'd been to once before, but only for a day hike. This time, I wanted to camp overnight and spend at least 2 nights in the wild to really disconnect. The forest was dense, with tall pine trees packed so close that their branches blocked out most of the sky during the day. The ground was covered in thick layers of pine needles and fallen leaves, making the forest floor soft but uneven. There were no marked trails where I set up camp. I wanted to find a spot away from the main paths, somewhere quiet and isolated. I packed everything carefully. A lightweight tent, a small but sturdy sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a portable stove, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and the usual hiking essentials like a compass, map, headlamp, and a small hatchet. I didn't bring a phone with signal. I wanted to be completely offline. Before heading in, I told a friend where I was going and when I'd be back, just in case. I arrived at the edge of the forest just before midday. The sun was high, and the air smelled fresh and clean, with a faint scent of pine and damp earth. I walked in, following a narrow dirt path that soon disappeared into thick underbrush. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No cars, no distant planes, no human voices, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. After about 2 hours of walking, I found a small clearing about the size of a living room. It was surrounded by tall trees and bushes, with a small patch of soft grass in the middle. A shallow stream trickled nearby, just out of sight behind some ferns. This felt right, far enough from any trails, hidden but not completely cut off from water. I set up my tent carefully, choosing a spot on the highest ground in the clearing to avoid any water runoff if it rained. I pitched the tent tightly, using every stake and cord I had, making sure it was stable. Then I gathered some dry wood and twigs for a fire. The sun was starting to lower behind the trees, sending long shadows across the clearing. That first evening was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal, instant noodles with some dried vegetables, and ate quietly by the fire. The flames crackled and popped, throwing flickering light onto the trees. As the sky darkened, stars began to appear. I sat back against a log and watched the stars, feeling small and calm in the vastness of the forest. But as darkness fell deeper, sounds I hadn't noticed before began to fill the night. Not the comforting ones, like owls hooting or the rustling of small animals, but heavier, stranger noises. At first, it was a faint snapping of twigs from somewhere just beyond the tree line. Then low thudding sounds, almost like footsteps, but heavier and slower. I told myself it was probably deer or maybe a bear moving around, but the rhythm felt different, almost deliberate. I sat perfectly still, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The noises stopped for a while, then started again, moving slowly around the perimeter of the clearing. It felt like something or someone was circling my camp. My heart rate quickened, but I told myself to stay calm. I checked my knife and held my flashlight ready. I decided to call it a night and crawl into the tent. The fire was dying down, but I left a small line of embers glowing to keep some light and warmth. Inside the tent, I zipped the door closed tightly and lay on my sleeping bag. The night outside was alive with sounds. Wind through the branches, distant animal calls, and those slow, heavy footsteps that hadn't stopped. The tent's thin fabric did little to block out the noise. Every sound seemed louder and closer. I kept my flashlight by my side and my knife within reach. My mind ran through all the scenarios. Maybe someone lost was wandering near. Maybe it was a poacher or someone else illegally in the forest. The thought that someone else might be out here unsettled me more than any animal. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing the footsteps moving, sometimes close, sometimes farther away. At one point, I heard a loud snap of a branch right next to the tent. I froze, heart pounding, but the sounds retreated after a few minutes. I whispered to myself that I would leave at first light if anything else happened. Morning finally came with a pale gray light filtering through the tent fabric. I unzipped the door and stepped outside carefully, looking around. Nothing was immediately visible, but I saw broken branches and fresh footprints in the soft soil just beyond the clearing. They weren't animal tracks, they looked like heavy boots, large and deep. That was when the fear settled in. Someone had been near my camp during the night. The footprints circled the clearing, moving slowly and deliberately. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but I didn't panic. I packed up my gear quickly, ate a small breakfast, and started walking back the way I came, keeping my eyes on the surroundings. As I walked, I kept hearing noises behind me. Branches breaking, footsteps in the distance, and once, what sounded like a low grunt. I didn't look back. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst, but I kept moving forward, faster and faster, until I was back on the marked trail. Once I was on the trail, I felt a little safer. There were faint sounds of other hikers and the distant hum of the nearby highway, but something still felt off. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone following. I didn't want to make noise or draw attention, so I stayed quiet and alert. About an hour later, I reached a small ranger station near the forest entrance. I told the ranger about the footprints and noises near my campsite. He nodded seriously and said there had been reports of illegal hunting and trespassing in that area recently. They were increasing patrols but warned that the woods could still be dangerous. The ranger gave me a ride back to my car, and I left the forest feeling shaken but relieved. The whole experience had been real. No supernatural stuff, just the very real fear of being alone in the woods with unknown people nearby and no way to call for help. Looking back, what terrified me the most wasn't just the footsteps or the sounds outside my tent. It was the knowledge that someone had been watching me, moving quietly and carefully around my camp, close enough to reach out and touch my tent if they wanted to. They didn't want to be seen, but they wanted to be near. That kind of fear, the feeling of being hunted or watched, is something primal. It's a survival instinct that kicks in and won't let you relax. Even now, months later, I still get a chill when I think about how close I came to a real danger. Not from animals, not from ghosts, but from other people who don't care about your safety. I still love camping, but now I'm more careful about where I go and who else might be there. I carry pepper spray and a much louder whistle. I don't camp alone anymore, and I always make sure someone knows exactly where I am. I had planned the trip for months, looking for a quiet weekend away from the city noise and work stress. The cabin was supposed to be my refuge, a small wooden place deep in the woods, rented out by some local family near the edge of a national forest. Nothing fancy, just a place to disconnect. No cell service, no internet. Just me, some books, my sleeping bag, and a lot of peace and quiet. I arrived just before dusk, driving a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through tall trees that blurred into shadows as the sun sank behind the hills. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I parked the car by the small clearing where the cabin stood. It looked like it had been there for decades, built from rough logs, a stone chimney with a thin trail of smoke curling up into the darkening sky. The place was smaller than I expected, maybe just one room with a loft upstairs. It had a heavy wooden door with an old iron latch, a few windows covered in grime, and a porch with a creaky swing. I carried my bags inside, dropping everything on the floor, then took a deep breath. The quiet was immediate and intense, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The first hour passed easily. I stacked firewood, checked that the stove worked, set up a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, and made a fire in the stone hearth. The warmth from the flames was comforting against the cool air creeping in through the cracks in the walls. Outside, the forest was almost pitch black, but every now and then, the firelight caught a pair of reflective eyes. Maybe a deer or some nocturnal animal watching me. I decided to stay up a bit, reading by the firelight. The cabin was basic but cozy. There was an old metal bed frame with a thin mattress in the corner, a small table with a candle holder, and shelves filled with dusty books and some mismatched dishes. The ceiling was low, made of rough beams, and the floor creaked when I moved. I told myself I was just tired from the drive and that the silence felt strange because I was used to noise all the time. But as the night deepened, I started noticing little things that unsettled me. The wind outside made the cabin moan and creak like it was alive. Sometimes I heard scratching sounds near the windows, like something trying to get in. I thought it was just animals, maybe squirrels or raccoons, but the noises seemed too sharp, too deliberate. At one point, I got up to check the door. The latch was secure, but there were faint scratch marks around the bottom, like claws had scraped against the wood. I felt a chill but told myself it was nothing. The forest was full of wildlife. It was normal. I went upstairs to the loft where the bed was. The mattress was thin and hard, but I was exhausted. I lay down, pulling the sleeping bag tight around me. The cabin was colder than I expected. The fire had died down, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. Then, I heard it again, a soft, deliberate tapping at the window below the loft. It wasn't random like rain or wind. It was steady, slow, and rhythmic, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. My heart pounded. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark glass, expecting to see a face or a shape, but there was nothing, just the blackness outside. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was a branch or a bird. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. Every small noise made me jump. The creaking of wood, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. My mind ran through worst-case scenarios. What if someone was out there watching me? What if I wasn't as alone as I thought? I wanted to grab my phone, but I knew there was no signal. I had tested it earlier. No calls, no texts, no way to get help if something went wrong. The tapping stopped after a while, but then I heard something worse. A slow, heavy thumping coming from the side of the cabin. Not light footsteps, but something heavy, dragging or stomping near the wall. I forced myself to get up and look out the window downstairs. There was nothing in the moonlight, just trees swaying in the wind. No footprints, no signs of animals large enough to make that noise. That's when the sense of being watched hit me fully. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed the small flashlight I had packed and crept down the stairs, trying to keep my breathing quiet. I shone the beam around the clearing and the edge of the woods. First, nothing. Then, way off in the distance, I thought I saw a flash of movement. Something quick, maybe a person or a large animal darting between the trees. I froze. My mind screamed to run, but I was alone, with no idea if this was someone dangerous or just a scared animal. I tried to rationalize. Maybe hunters or hikers who had lost their way. But it was late, almost midnight. No one should be out here. I returned to the loft, locking the door behind me. My nerves were raw. I wrapped myself in the sleeping bag and pulled out my pocket knife, feeling foolish but reassured by the weight of it in my hand. Hours passed in restless half-sleep, broken by strange noises. At one point, I heard something scrape against the side of the cabin again. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was trying to open or break in. I wanted to shout, to run outside, but I was too scared and tired. Instead, I lay still, trying to listen and figure out what to do. When dawn finally broke, pale light filtered through the grimy windows. I was exhausted, my body aching from the cold and tension. I gathered my courage and went outside to check for any signs of what had disturbed me. The ground was soft and wet from overnight rain. I saw footprints, 2 sets, large boots, leading from the tree line to the cabin, circling it, and then disappearing back into the woods. The prints were fresh. That was when the full weight of the situation hit me. Someone had been watching me, maybe even waiting for me to arrive. The thought that someone could be out there, close enough to make noise and leave tracks, but still hidden, was terrifying. I packed my bags quickly, trying not to make noise. My hands trembled as I double-checked the cabin, making sure nothing was missing or damaged. The door and windows were all intact, but the scratches and signs of someone being there were clear. I didn't stop to eat or look around. I locked the door as best I could, ran to my car, and started the engine. The dirt road seemed longer and darker on the way out. Every shadow made me jump, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally reached the main road, with cell service and other cars passing by, relief washed over me. I called the local police and reported the break-in signs and the footprints. They said they would send someone to check it out, but no one was hurt and nothing was taken, so it wasn't their highest priority. That night, back in my apartment, I kept the lights on and the doors locked. The experience left a mark. I realized that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but the very real possibility of another person. Unknown, unseen, maybe dangerous, watching you when you think you're alone. The sky was bruised purple when I finally pulled off the main road and onto the dirt track leading to the cabin. It had been a long drive, hours over cracked asphalt, then a slow crawl on a narrow gravel path flanked by dense woods. I was alone, like I planned, craving the kind of silence that drowns out every city noise and clutters your mind with nothing but the crackling of the forest. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, hidden enough to feel like my own secret. I'd found it through a simple ad on a rental site, rustic cabin, no cell service, perfect for a weekend away. The pictures showed a small wooden structure with a slanted roof and a stone chimney, sitting on a slight rise overlooking a still pond. It looked peaceful, untouched by time, exactly what I wanted. As I stepped out of the car, the air hit me with that fresh, pine-scented chill, the kind that snaps your senses awake. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows through the trees, and the whole forest felt like it was holding its breath. The gravel crunched under my boots as I pulled my gear out of the trunk. A backpack with food, a small camping stove, water, a flashlight, and a thick wool blanket. I locked the car and started up the narrow dirt path toward the cabin. It wasn't far, maybe 100 yards, but with every step, the world around me grew quieter, heavier. The rustle of leaves and distant bird calls were the only sounds. No cars, no people, no hum of civilization. Just the forest. The cabin itself looked exactly as I'd imagined. It was weathered but sturdy, the wood darkened with age but solid. The windows were small, some cracked, but the door was intact, hanging on strong hinges. A stone porch wrapped around one side, where an old rocking chair sat abandoned, its paint peeling. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and something earthy, like moss and old firewood. The air was cooler than outside, thick with the smell of closed-in space. Dust lay on the floorboards, thick enough to see footprints from the previous visitors. I dropped my bag by the door and lit a few candles I'd brought, the flickering flames casting warm light over the rough-hewn furniture. There was a small kitchen area, with a cast-iron stove and a sink that looked like it hadn't worked in years. A wooden table sat in the middle, covered in scratches and stains. The bedroom was a tiny loft above, reached by a steep ladder. A single bed was stuffed with old blankets and a thin mattress that promised little comfort. I unpacked my supplies slowly, trying to shake off the long drive. I set up my little stove and boiled water for coffee. The kettle whistled softly, a comforting sound in the otherwise still cabin. I drank slowly, looking out the window at the darkening woods. The pond was just visible through the trees, its surface smooth like glass. As night fell, The forest around the cabin became a different world. The shadows grew deeper, the shapes of trees twisting in the candlelight. The silence thickened. I kept busy, chopping some firewood I found stacked by the porch and building a small fire in the stone hearth. The fire crackled and popped, sending warm orange light dancing on the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, making the branches scrape against the cabin like fingernails on wood. The sound was sharp, a harsh whisper that crawled into the corners of the room. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and sat close to the fire, trying to convince myself I was safe. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and the candles flickered dangerously. Then I heard it, a sudden, sharp noise from outside, a snap like a broken twig underfoot. My heart jumped. I froze, straining to listen. Another snap, this time closer. Then the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on gravel. I grabbed my flashlight and edged toward the window. The beam cut through the black outside but revealed nothing. The woods were still. The pond gleamed faintly in the moonlight, perfectly still. I told myself it was probably a deer or some small animal, but my skin prickled with unease. The forest had shifted somehow, the quiet now feeling less like peace and more like waiting. I went back to the fire, trying to ignore the noise. Minutes later, I heard it again. The slow, deliberate sound of footsteps crunching toward the cabin, heavier this time, not like an animal but a person. I swallowed hard. There was no cell service here, no way to call for help. The cabin's windows didn't lock properly, just rusty latches. I moved quietly to the door and checked the lock. It held, but barely. The footsteps stopped just outside. A long, heavy silence settled over the cabin. My breath felt loud in the quiet, and every instinct screamed at me to get out. I grabbed a heavy cast iron skillet from the kitchen and stood near the door, listening. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. My heart slammed against my ribs. Whoever it was trying to open it. The old wood groaned but held firm. I braced myself, the skillet raised. The rattling stopped. For what felt like an eternity, the only sound was my own breathing and the faint crackle of the dying fire. Then, footsteps retreated into the woods, slow and deliberate, fading into the distance. I waited, frozen in place, until the sounds were gone. I bolted the door and pushed a heavy chair against it for extra security. I sat down, heart hammering, and lit every candle I had left, surrounding myself with light. The rest of the night was a restless blur. Every noise made me jump, the wind scraping the trees, the occasional rustle of leaves. I didn't sleep much, staying alert and listening for any sign of return. By first light, the woods looked normal again, the fear fading with the morning sun. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking. The quiet that had felt peaceful the day before now felt oppressive and dangerous. I locked the cabin door behind me and hurried down the path to my car, eyes scanning the treeline. The gravel track was empty. No footprints, no signs of anyone nearby. Driving away, I glanced back once at the cabin. The stillness of the forest masked the terror I'd felt there. I knew I wasn't imagining it. The footsteps, the rattling door, the presence of someone watching me in that dark silence. What had they wanted? Why here in this forgotten cabin? I'll never know. But one thing was clear, I wouldn't go back. Some places are meant to stay empty, left alone in the deep woods where the silence isn't peaceful but a warning. I never thought a weekend in a cabin would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I'd planned the trip alone, partly for some peace and quiet, away from the noise of the city and work, and partly because I love the outdoors. I'm not an experienced outdoorsman by any means, but I know enough to get by. I found a small cabin to rent deep in the woods about a 3-hour drive from where I live. It was advertised as remote, off the grid, perfect for hiking and relaxing in nature. That's what I wanted. The drive was long but peaceful. The highway slowly gave way to smaller roads, then gravel paths surrounded by dense forests. The kind of forest where the trees grow thick and the sunlight barely reaches the ground. I arrived just before sunset. The cabin was exactly as advertised, small, wooden, weathered by time but still solid. It sat in a clearing with tall pines surrounding it, and behind it, I could see the steep slope of a hill. No neighbors for miles. Perfect. I pulled my car up to the front and stepped out, the smell of pine needles and damp earth filling my lungs. I carried my bags inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished but comfortable. A small stove, a wooden table, a few chairs, and a narrow bed in the corner. There was no electricity, just a stack of firewood next to the stove and some candles. The water came from a nearby well, and the outhouse was out back. It was basic, but I expected that. The first night passed uneventfully. I made a fire, cooked some simple food, and fell asleep listening to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirping, the occasional owl hoot. Nothing unusual. The cabin was quiet except for those natural sounds. The next day, I set out on a hike. The forest was beautiful, thick with undergrowth and fallen leaves. The trail wasn't well marked, but I had a basic map and a compass. I followed the path for a few hours, enjoying the silence and the fresh air. When I returned to the cabin, I felt relaxed and satisfied with the day's adventure. That night, as I settled in, I noticed something odd. There were fresh footprints outside the cabin door. I was alone, and the cabin had no neighbors nearby, so who could have been there? I told myself it was probably an animal or maybe someone hiking nearby who passed through. The footprints were too big for a deer, maybe a person wearing boots. I didn't feel threatened, but made sure to lock the cabin door. The following day, I spent more time around the cabin, chopping firewood and gathering water. I kept an eye out for anyone or anything unusual. As the day wore on, I noticed the footprints again, this time leading into the woods behind the cabin. They looked fresh, as if someone had been watching the cabin or walking close by. That evening, I started to feel uneasy. I made sure all the windows and doors were locked tight before going to bed. I kept a small pocket knife by the bed, just in case. I told myself I was overthinking it. After all, I was in the middle of the woods, and someone else could have been camping or hiking nearby. But then, as the night deepened, I heard noises outside. Not animal noises, something different. Soft footsteps crunching on the dry leaves, slow and deliberate. I froze, heart pounding. I stayed as still as possible, trying to listen. The sound stopped, then started again, circling the cabin. The footsteps were too heavy and too quiet at the same time, like someone trying to move without being heard but still making enough noise to be noticed. I didn't sleep much that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the window with the curtains drawn, watching for any sign of movement. The moon was thin, barely lighting the clearing. The next morning, I found something else. The firewood I had stacked neatly was scattered around, some logs broken. My food supplies had been moved. Nothing stolen, but clearly disturbed. Whoever or whatever had been here was getting closer, getting bolder. I started thinking about what I should do. My cell phone had no signal. The cabin was out of range of any network. I considered hiking back to the nearest road, but it was miles away, and I wasn't sure if whoever had been watching me was still nearby. I decided to stay put and prepare. I gathered more firewood, sharpened a few sticks, and found some heavy stones. I blocked the windows with chairs and furniture to make it harder for someone to get inside quickly. I made sure the door was barricaded as well. That night, the footsteps returned, but this time they didn't circle the cabin. They stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing, low and steady. It felt like the person was waiting for something. I gripped the pocket knife tightly, sweat dripping down my forehead. Hours passed. Nothing happened. Then, just as I was about to lose hope that they might leave, I heard scratching at the door. Slow, deliberate scratches, like someone running a nail or a blade along the wood. The sound echoed in the silence of the forest. I realized I had no choice. If this person was trying to get inside, I needed to be ready. I grabbed my makeshift spear and got into a defensive stance. The scratching stopped. The footsteps moved away slowly, fading into the night. I didn't sleep at all that night. At dawn, I ventured outside cautiously. I found more footprints, dozens of them, leading into the forest away from the cabin. They looked fresh, and I knew whoever was out there was still around. The next day, I packed my gear, ready to leave. I wasn't taking any chances, but as I started walking toward the trailhead, I saw something that froze me in place. About 50 feet from the cabin, partially hidden in the underbrush, was a small, makeshift campsite. There was a fire pit with ashes, a few blankets, and some empty cans. Someone had been living close by without my knowledge. I felt violated. I thought I was alone out here, but someone had been watching me, maybe even living here for days or weeks. The thought sent a chill down my spine. I moved quickly toward the trail, looking over my shoulder the whole way. The forest felt different now, thick, dark, and hostile. Every sound made me jump. I made it back to my car safely and drove away as fast as I could. Later, after I was back in the city, I called the local ranger station to report the incident. They told me that area was known for some squatters and illegal campers, some of whom could be dangerous. They advised me never to go back alone, especially without telling anyone. The experience stayed with me for weeks. I kept thinking about the person who had been so close to me, watching from the shadows, invading my space. The fear wasn't about ghosts or monsters. It was about real people, real threats. The kind of fear that comes from knowing someone can be right outside your door, and you don't know what they want or what they're capable of. That cabin trip was supposed to be a peaceful escape, but it ended up being a lesson. Nature is beautiful but unpredictable, and people can be dangerous in ways you don't expect. I never returned to that cabin, and I never went camping alone again. The memory of those footsteps outside the door, the scratches on the wood, and the hidden camp in the forest are burned into my mind. It was the kind of fear that stays with you, not because of anything supernatural, but because it's real, close, and raw.